Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway,
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel. I'm Mark Dolan. This is Mark Dolan Tonight. It's 8 o'clock. This hour, has Britain moved on from Boris Johnson? We'll speak to one of his top supporters. Also, have we finally put Brexit to bed? And why is there so much focus on net zero and not enough on actual pollution? Big guests, big stories, and always big opinions. A lively 3 hours to come. But first, the headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Mark, thank you and good evening. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The first state visit of King Charles to France has been postponed because of protests across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King was due to arrive on Sunday as part of a week-long trip to Europe. The French president has suggested the new date for the visit will be in the early summer. The Windsor Framework has been formally adopted by the UK and the EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement. That's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values during a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu's in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation of tensions in the West Bank. Well, outside Downing Street, demonstrators describe Netanyahu's controversial reforms as unacceptable. Security guards at Heathrow Airport will go ahead with strikes over the Easter holiday after talks over pay have failed. The airport says it has contingency plans in place to deal with the 10-day walkout and keep it running as normal. Heathrow says they've offered a 10% pay increase to its workers. And Ofsted says school inspections will continue despite calls from teaching unions for them to be suspended. 3 unions say they should be paused while a review is carried out. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January whilst awaiting her school report. The Ofsted chief says that wouldn't be in the best interests of children. However, head teacher Sophie Greenaway says the mental health of staff should be a priority. And the Premier League has referred Everton to an independent commission to question reported losses of over £370 million. Everton's loss during the 2021-22 season allegedly breaches the league's profit and financial sustainability rules, allowing clubs to lose a maximum of £105 million over a 3-year period or face sanctions. TV, online and DAB Plus radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Mark Dolan tonight.
It's Friday night. Welcome to Mark Dolan Tonight. This hour, has Britain moved on from Boris Johnson? Also, have we finally put Brexit to bed, or is that wishful thinking? And why is there so much focus on net zero and not enough on actual pollution? From 9 in my big opinion, 3 years on from the first lockdown, my reaction to the moment the free world lost its mind. We were mad to go along with it. My Mark Meets guest is the priest and best-selling author Fergus Butler Galley, who tells me how God can survive the 21st century and why priests are no angels. In the big story, as the people of France revolt over pensions reform, why do us Brits take everything lying down? Does this country need a bit of revolutionary spirit when it comes to unpopular government measures? I want to hear from you throughout the show. mark@gbnews.uk. A very big 3 hours to come. And let's start with this. Following his grilling in the House of Commons on Wednesday, the BBC Question Time audience could not find a single person, including Conservative supporters, to say that they believed what he had to say. That was on last night's Question Time. Meanwhile, given that just 20 Conservative MPs voted against Rishi Sunak's Brexit breakthrough, the Windsor framework, it would appear that Boris's hopes of leading a substantial rebellion against the PM's plans were unfulfilled. A damp squib. So has the country and the electorate moved on from Boris Johnson? Has Boris now been consigned to the political scrap heap? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome broadcaster, socialite and political commentator Lady Victoria Hervey. Victoria,
hello.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Has Britain finally moved on from Boris Johnson?
Yeah, I think we have, actually. You know, in the beginning I was very pro-Boris, you know. It was that sort of public schoolboy, Etonian, scruffy hair look. I think that deceived a lot of us.
Freedom-loving.
Yeah, but the fact that when you actually do kind of look at his history, like he actually was a young, you know, leader with the World Economic Forum with Klaus Schwab.
Is that right? Now, this, of course, is an unelected global group.
I think with him, he is sort of masquerading, pretending to be a conservative, but he actually ended up being super liberal.
Yes, and of course, when you say liberal, you've just come back from a few years in the United States.
I have,
that basically means it's an American term for
the other side.
Lefty, right?
Way more lefty than Joe Biden
you think
could ever be.
that Boris shifted to the left?
He did, absolutely. I think he was pretending to be something that he wasn't, to get a certain agenda out there.
And I guess we'll have seen a lot of that in his response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Exactly.
His response was hardly conservative.
No, not at all. I mean, it was ridiculous. What, lock up the whole country just because there's a flu? Ridiculous.
What did you make of his performance on Wednesday? He looked like he was under pressure. His allies argue he smashed it. Others think that actually he's going to get some kind of punishment and there will be a by-election. What do you think?
What kind of punishment do you think he's going to get? I don't know. I mean,
hard to punish Boris,
he just needs to, because he kind of like, he comes across as this sort of buffoon, this sort of bumbling bee going along, but he's actually really smart. Like, I think he is very intelligent, but he plays that fool, and I think people get deceived from him a lot of the time. So, you know, he plays that. And just the whole fracking thing, the whole net zero, like all of that.
Oh, yeah, so this
I mean,
is
we
the
are
fact
now,
that...
we are not energy efficient anymore in England, right? So we're getting our natural gas from the US, and then that is being imported to England, and how is it being sent? Like, OK, it's being flown over here, or, you know, like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, so your argument is that Boris has been very much in hoc to the net zero movement. Again, perhaps it's a very conservative philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
And then Liz Truss, obviously, she did try and bring back fracking, didn't she? And that didn't go down very well.
So what happened to Boris? Why did he dilute Brexit, even though he was supposed to be such a Brexiteer? Why did he respond to the pandemic and give in to SAGE and their advisors? And why did he swallow the net zero narrative?
Well, I think with Brexit, he kept changing his mind. Like, he then pretended, right, he wanted Brexit, but originally he didn't want Brexit. He completely flipped it just so he would be voted in. So he's like one of those people that he will change his mind just to suit a current agenda for his own purpose, which I think is a big red flag, and it should have been a big red flag.
But I've got lots of viewers and listeners who still love Boris, and they feel that he was chucked out of power in an undemocratic coup by disloyal cabinet ministers like Rishi Sunak, who's now PM. What would you say to my listeners and viewers who are missing Boris and want him back?
Look, well, he had his time, didn't he? This is a difference between England and America. You see, America, they don't throw them out, which, you know, look, we've still got Joe Biden over there.
Yeah.
And here they get sick of someone and the next one comes in. It's kind of like a musical chairs with continual process over here. So what would I say? I don't know. I really like Boris as well, you know.
So do you feel let down by Boris?
I do. I feel definitely very let down by Boris. But I feel like he plays that. He's a bit of an actor.
Have you met him? Do you know the guy?
I have met him once, yeah.
And what were your impressions of him?
Yeah, I liked him. He's a likeable character, isn't he?
Yeah, I mean, you're from the world very much of showbiz, bit of an aristocrat as well, and now political commentator. Boris, is he more showbiz than politics, do you think? Did he choose the wrong vocation?
Possibly. I mean, I know he's now, you know, he has a lot of children by different women that he now has to go into many public appearances to probably pay for all those children. So, yeah, he probably needs to keep his trousers up.
Now, you mentioned the World Economic Forum. Isn't that a bit of a conspiracy theory?
No, it's true.
The idea that Boris is somehow a protégé of Klaus Schwab? Because for viewers and listeners
he went to the training school of Klaus Schwab.
Did he?
You know, who is basically trying to depopulate the planet.
That's a hell of an accusation. You really think that Klaus Schwab is trying to depopulate the planet?
He talks about it in his own book.
Does he?
Yes.
How's he planning to depopulate the planet?
How do you think?
Crumbs. Well, listen, this is a pretty dark conversation.
I know.
Look, on this programme, all opinions are welcome, but I don't think there's any evidence to prove that Klaus Schwab or the WEF have necessarily a dark intent, but you're entitled to your view. What many people don't like about this character, this unelected figure of Klaus Schwab and the WEF, is that they meet once a year with the good and the great in Davos, planning our future. And I don't think anyone appreciates that.
No, and planning, you know, which pandemics are going to unleash on us, you know.
It's another very harsh accusation. You think this is all planned?
It's all true.
This whole thing. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence that the pandemic?
There's some really good documentaries on it, but Plandemic was a very good one. And I met the people that made that film. I actually went to quite a few different events in America while I was living there during that time. And a lot of people that had been censored in the media were all there. All the doctors that had been censored, you know, Judy Mikovits, Sherry Tenpenny, all these people. And it was just so interesting, like, actually hearing them talking.
But do you not buy the theory that the COVID came from a lab leak?
Oh, I
standards in Chinese labs are notoriously
No. I believe it came from the Wuhan lab, just like Trump said in the beginning. Like, everything that Trump said, it actually became true. You know,
Sure.
He
but
said
deliberately leaked? I mean, why would China and the West bring that on themselves?
Do you not watch Project Veritas? There's a lot of info on that.
Look, I look at everything. My mind is open, which is why you'll never get cancelled on my watch. How do you feel when others might characterise what you've said as a conspiracy theory?
Usually conspiracy theories are always true. They're just...
Give it 6 months.
Yeah, that's what a lot of you... Yeah, but even a year, you know. I mean, now they're still talking about the Wuhan lab leak. Oh, Joe Biden's now saying that we have confirmation. We knew this over 3 years ago. Like, what are they talking about?
Yeah, no, well, listen, I do think that many voices have been silenced in the course of the pandemic, which is the topic of my big opinion. It's 3 years on from the first lockdown.
Yeah, and they're supposed to be bringing out another pandemic in 2025.
What, you think there's another virus coming?
According to Agenda 2030, yeah.
Well, crumbs, here's hoping that doesn't happen. Do you think the public would be as forthcoming in a future pandemic? Would the British people swallow another lockdown, do you think?
No, and what I love about England is that people were really standing up for themselves, where in America they weren't. No one was on the streets. You know, I would come back to England, and when I wasn't allowed to come back here, and I would see it on the news, and obviously a lot of the news wasn't even showing how many people were out there. But that is a big difference. But there is also the talk of climate lockdowns. You know, and Agenda 2030 is all about how they want to do these, you know, turn us into these little 12-minute cities and where we can't move freely.
Sure.
And then the actual plan is to completely erase us being able to fly anywhere. So we're going to completely not be able to fly at all.
You know, many people would say there's no evidence for what you've just said. However, lots of public figures have talked about rationing our air miles. Some people have talked about a carbon allowance.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that, you know, one should be open-minded to these things. I've looked in detail at the 15-minute city policy, and the local authorities that roll it out argue that it's to control pollution, and it's also traffic calming, safer for kids, and also no one's locked in those areas. I mean, it's
not
just
yet,
that you use your car.
But that could happen in the future.
Well, here's hoping it doesn't.
You know,
but look,
I mean, you know, it starts as something under a different pretext, right? And then when people fall for it, then they can change the rules.
Quick word on Donald Trump. He is seeking the nomination of the Republican Party to be their nominee for President of the United States. Does he win the nomination, and does he win in a year's time?
I would like to see him win. I mean, I don't want to move back to America unless he would, you know, he would be the winning candidate.
You will not return to America.
Yeah, I might go visit, but I would never want to live there again.
Is that right? So you basically, you refuse to live in America again under President Joe Biden?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Just because the whole place is complete chaos right now. And it has been for a long time, and it's so polarised and just, I don't know how to even explain it.
What would Trump do to make America better in your estimation? Why is it that you would consider living in America again under President Trump?
Well, he makes it safe. And that is one of the main things. And I was very pro, like, the border wall, as an example. And people don't realise a lot of this, the border jumpers, they're not just Mexicans. They are people from China. They are people from all kinds of, like, terrorist countries. It's not just little ladies with kids. You don't see that. It's actually, like, guys who are a real threat to America by coming through the border.
Victoria, it's never boring having you here. I look forward to our next on-air encounter. What a great debate. Your response to what Victoria's had to say, Mark, at gbnews.uk. Coming up, after the new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland was formally adopted by the UK and the EU today, I'll be asking a top former MEP whether we can now put Brexit to bed. Here's hoping. See you in 2.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my common sense crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel. Today, the new Brexit deal for Northern Ireland has been formally adopted by the UK and the EU. The so-called Windsor Framework is designed to make trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK easier. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator said the framework allowed the UK and the EU to begin a new chapter in relations. Maros Sefcovic was in London today to ratify the new post-Brexit deal with UK Foreign Secretary James Cleverly. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator said the framework allowed the UK and the EU to move on and to have a better future for both sides. Well, look, let's get the view now on the Windsor framework and whether or not Brexit has finally been put to bed. In the company of former Conservative MEP for the East of England, Brexit supporter and chairman of the Freedom Association, David C. Bannerman. David, thanks for making time to join us tonight. Can we finally put Brexit to bed?
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
I'm afraid not. I know it's very tempting to do so. I think the Windsor Agreement is kind of a short-term fix, but already today we're hearing something like 300 plants are not covered by it. And there's hauliers saying that, that it does actually provide a sort of hard border between East and West. So I think to be honest, I think we're going to have to revisit it. Maybe this is a short-term step forward. But I tell you what is really concerning is that we're still tied into EU rules, and it might mean our trade deals like with India or the Trans-Pacific Partnership are actually, damaged by this agreement. And that is very, very serious. What they've done is put us in a position where if we actually move away, then we either leave Northern Ireland behind with the EU for goods and do our own trade deals, etc., or we have to stay within the orbit of the EU, which I think was always the intention, to keep us tied to EU rules.
However, David, isn't it time we held our nose, accepted this deal and moved on? After all, many Eurosceptics have argued that if they'd been offered this deal 3 years ago, they'd have bitten your hand off.
Well, it is better than the current arrangements. I do accept that, but it's a bit of a short-term fix. But there are some worse elements to it, which is there's more power for the EU for this joint committee between the UK and the EU. And I actually served on joint committees when I was an MEP. And that is concerning because it's kind of less temporary and more fixed in certain ways. So I think we're going to have to see how it plays out. You know, it has been passed through the Commons. Very strange procedural device to use a statutory instrument rather than an actual act of Parliament, which you might expect. But let's see how it pans out. I think there will be some issues, and we may well have to revisit it. And obviously the DUP are not going to go back to the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is the whole point of doing a deal on this, surely.
There's been something of a drama in Westminster today on WhatsApp. Yes, WhatsApp has reared its ugly head again, this time the ERG WhatsApp group. Now, the ERG is the European Research Group of prominent Tory Brexiteer backbenchers. And one of their leading lights is Steve Baker, who is, of course, a Northern Ireland minister. And he's been on this group today effectively saying we don't need to exist anymore. Is it the end of the ERG, do you think, particularly given the rather weak response to this legislation in the House of Commons? Only 20-odd Tories voted against it. So is the ERG no more?
No, I'm an honorary member of the RG. I'm proud to be so. Don't forget, I mean, OK, only 22 MPs voted against, but 48 actually abstained, Tory MPs. Put that together, that's 70. That's larger than our majority of 67. And it means that Rishi Sunak had to rely on Labour votes to get this vote through. No, it isn't the end of the RG. It isn't the end of the debate. Look, I've got a huge regard for Steve Baker. I worked very closely with him on the Brexit referendum, and he's a great guy. But, you know, this is a bit of a storm in a teacup, I think. But you know, I do have deep concerns about the so-called Windsor agreement. And that remains, especially as the attempt has always been to keep us chained to EU rules. They tried it with the backstop. They tried it with Chequers. Now we've got the Windsor Agreement tying us to EU rules.
I can't imagine Rishi Sunak would call this deal perfect either. But perhaps, David, Sunak has identified that the British people, including Brexit-supporting voters, also want to move on.
Well, I think we all do want to move on. I'd like to move on. But you've got to do it on the right basis, because otherwise it's going to come back to haunt you. And if it derails our trade deals and we suddenly find that, you know, we're still actually reporting to the EU and the European Court of Justice, that's not acceptable. And we really must sort the issue. And I think we should have got the Northern Ireland Protocol bill that Boris introduced through Parliament just to give us the option. And actually, clearly, that drove the EU to negotiate with us. So I'm afraid I don't think it's the end of the story. It will go on.
The Tories, David, your former party, former MEP, Conservative MEP, what's your appraisal of Sunak's premiership? Because he's just starting to now make up ground in the polls against Keir Starmer and Labour. He's had his so-called Brexit breakthrough with the Windsor framework. He's committed to stopping the boats. Whether or not he achieves that is another thing. He's settled the economy. Does this guy have momentum?
Well, I'm afraid you have to look at the polls, and the polls today showed us going down 4% and Labour going up 3%. So they're nearly at 50%, and we're nearly at half that at sort of 23%. I mean, the polls aren't changing very much. Now, Northern Ireland, you know, it's very important to me, it's very important to a lot of us. But, you know, the Great British public are often more interested in the cost of living or the NHS or whatever. And we'll have to see how that plays out. I think stopping the boats, small boats coming over, is probably actually more in their mind at the moment than the protocol, which often they won't understand the detail. I mean, it's very complex. So we'll have to see, but it is down to the polls. We're still way behind. I mean, when they got rid of Boris, he was only 2 to 4% behind, and now we're 30% behind. So there are some real issues here, and I'm very, very concerned about where we're heading. You know, I don't want to be out of power for 10 years or 13 years like under Blair. What damage will Labour do in that timescale? That would be very worrying.
I would hardly, David, use BBC's Question Time programme as a barometer of public opinion. But last night, they do claim to have a balanced audience politically. Not a single member of the studio audience could raise their hand and say that they believed what Boris Johnson said to the House of Commons in the Partygate inquiry on Wednesday. Do you think that the public have moved on from Boris Johnson?
I don't think they have, actually. I mean, I saw a bit of that Question Time. I saw that poll. Look, people are intimidated, you know, especially in an audience situation on television. I'm afraid, you know, it wasn't a great, as you know, as was said at the time, it wasn't actually a scientific poll. And I wouldn't take much out of it, because that audience, I'm afraid they don't vet audiences that they used to in the past. It is, you know, it is pretty biased, and I regret that, because you need to have a balanced audience, as they used to do. They used to spend a lot of time and money to actually balance audiences. They don't do that anymore. So I'm afraid, you know, I think the public is still very pro-Boris in many ways, and the party is still very pro-Boris. So I wouldn't write him off. You know, things can change in politics, and they can change very rapidly.
Last but not least, David, on Monday, the Reform UK party had a big press conference that featured a good friend of the show, Anne Widdecombe. They've said they're going to fight the Tories in every constituency at the next election. Could they keep Rishi Sunak out of number 10 and install Sir Keir Starmer?
Yes, I mean, that's what worries me about reform. You know, I respect some of the policies. I think Anne Widdecombe's wonderful. You know, I know her when she was a Conservative. You know, she used to come and help me, actually, in certain places. But the trouble with reform, it's about 6% it's polling at, and it goes up to about 9% at most. And there is a danger it will just help to get Sir Keir Starmer in and wipe out centre-right politics. And the other thing is, it is actually just like a company. It's a one-man company. It doesn't listen to its members. And I'm chairman of CDO, the Conservative Democratic Organisation, which is all about re-empowering the Conservative Party membership. So there are some issues about reform, you know, and I just feel it might derail us and actually just ensure that Keir Starmer gets 10 years or more in power, which doesn't suit us.
David, thank you for joining us live from England's second city, Birmingham. Brilliant conversation. Your reaction, Mark at gbnews.uk. Coming up next, why is there so much focus on net zero and not enough on actual pollution? Where are the priorities? We'll discuss that next.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Emails coming in thick and fast. Has Britain moved on from Boris Johnson? This from Raymond, a very long and well-written email. Thank you, Raymond. Raymond has said, Dear Mark, good leadership at a minimum requires courage, conviction, a moral compass and ethical integrity. Boris has none of these necessary character traits. Indeed, despite his oft-lauded charisma and intelligence, he all too often displays that his interest is purely a selfish one. In essence, he is an arrogant narcissist from the top of his deliberately ruffled mop to his slovenly dress and bearing. Back in my days as a cadet at Sandhurst, Boris's incorrigible faults would have been quickly identified by our senior warrant officer, guards, instructors and mentors. Raymond, thank you for that. Victoria Hervey, the socialite, was on the show earlier. She was talking about the World Economic Forum, which is an unelected group of thinkers who, of course, gather once a year in Davos. The good and the great turn up. Tony Blair, Bill Gates, sometimes our own politicians as well. Many of you are not having it. Annette says, Mark, your guest Victoria is absolutely right. There's something very sinister going on in the world. There are layers above government and we're being controlled by megalomaniacs. Lady Victoria, so good on the wicked pandemic, says Cynthia. What's the matter with people? All the evidence there, unexplained deaths, miscarriages through the vaccines, etc. Klaus Schwab banging the table saying we're in charge and we are in all governments. Wake up, people, and say never again. Cynthia, thank you for that. Look, this show is all about opinions. You're entitled to yours. I don't think there's any evidence that the World Economic Forum are controlling the planet. But hey, my mind is open and we debate everything on this show. So keep those opinions coming. Mark at gbnews.uk. I certainly don't like the idea of an unelected cabal deciding our futures. Thanks, but no thanks. Elizabeth, Mark, I would never judge anything from a BBC Question Time packed audience. And on Rishi Sunak, Mark, says Linda, Rishi Sunak is taking us back into the EU by the back door. He has told us that he's a Brexiteer, but he has lied. There you go. We'll get to more of your emails shortly, Mark at gbnews.uk. But with all of the talk of net zero, a seeming obsession with mainstream politicians, academia and the corporate world, are we ignoring a greater and more immediate menace? Pollution. Who talks about pollution? Do we need to have a wider debate about what preserving the environment actually means? And what are the priorities? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome columnist at The Spectator magazine, Alex Marshall. Hi, Alex.
Very nice to see you today.
Great to have you back on GB News. We've missed you massively, especially your truth bombs. Let's talk about this focus on net zero. I remember when I was a kid, pollution seemed to be the big problem.
Yes, when I was growing up in Australia, the big thing down here was Clean Up Australia Day, and all the kids would go out and try and clean up their local areas. But you never hear about that anymore. Our children are out gluing themselves to the pavement for some corporate and political net zero nightmare that we've got. And in the meantime, they leave all their rubbish strewn across the roads and the parks. So certainly the next generation don't seem to be very aware of the problem of pollution. And definitely in Australia, we've just finished banning plastic straws here in New South Wales. But of course, we're not doing anything about the thousands of solar panels headed toward our landfill, which is creating the next generation of pollution problems. So you're perfectly right. There's very little interest in pollution. And I have to wonder if it's because real problems like pollution cost a fortune to fix and they don't get you any election victories, whereas net zero is more of a corporate and political dream where they get to make money out of the public purse.
I wonder whether there are parallels with net zero and the COVID-19 pandemic. An opportunity to control people, a massive opportunity for huge corporations to make a lot of money, all done by scaring the bejesus out of us.
You're quite right. It is all a deviation from apocalypse politics. That is, you say, there is some giant existential threat. And if you don't do as we say, then the world is going to end or you're going to die in some way, shape or form, which of course is just a ludicrous kind of way to run politics and corporations. But with net zero, it's so insidious now that we're basically punishing companies and refusing to give them banking loans if they don't adhere to this climate change saga, which has, as you say, nothing to do with improving the state of the world. If they cared about the environment, then they'd be out there planting trees, living in the bush, and helping to actually fix the problems that we've got. Instead, all I can see is these layers upon layers of corporate and political governance to do with how you adhere to this international bureaucracy that's decided what's good for the environment, which actually doesn't seem to do anything at a local level.
However, governments and corporations that you've mentioned would argue that the vast majority of scientists point to the fact that the planet is heating up, carbon emissions are behind it. That many people can't be wrong. And in the end, the Earth is on fire.
You'd like to think that, Mark, but how many of those experts were wrong about the assumptions they made on COVID? And the answer is all of them were wrong about the assumptions of COVID. And the same thing is true of the environment. They keep pushing out their apocalypse deadline because it doesn't happen. The weather is essentially the same as it was. We're not drowning under rising sea levels. I live at sea level and it hasn't changed in the past 200 years since our family farm has been there. We're not underwater. And neither are the Pacific Islands, most of which are actually growing and not shrinking. So what we have here is an agreement, a global agreement that is profiting lots of people who hold the reins of power. And so they're hardly going to come and say, sorry, we lied about the climate thing, because at that point, the public money will stop. And so it's only when people start saying no.
Yeah. However, Alex, what about the sort of freak weather incidents, you know, the forest fires? What about London experiencing 40-degree heat last summer? What about, you know, the empty reservoirs and migrating populations?
Well, with the London summer, they'd point you back to the summer of love when it was much hotter. And as far as forest fires go in Australia and Canada, what we actually have is a problem with policy. So in Australia, for instance, we've been on the news because apparently we're on fire every other week. Well, they locked our parks up. They took away the management of our parks, closed all the gates and stopped managing fire trails and doing backburning when they're supposed to. And so suddenly we have no fires for 10 years in an area, and then we have these apocalyptic style fires because our bush has to burn. But these green policies, which are called lockdown policies, they are causing an increase in wildfire. So our problem in Australia is not temperature, which has barely changed. You go back to 1910, our temperature was hotter. It's our greenies who think that they can micromanage parks in a new way, and they're causing catastrophic errors in judgment.
Yeah. COVID measures, going back to those, you just mentioned them. I think that we'd be in a better position if we'd had a cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns, if we'd had not just medics and scientists of diverse opinion, but economists as well, sociologists, entrepreneurs, educators, to actually look at, you know, what the possible human and economic cost of the lockdowns would have been. We probably need a cost-benefit analysis for net zero as well.
But I'll tell you what, with over $1 trillion pouring into net zero, I'd say there's a pretty good reason to do an audit on this thing and find out where the money's actually going. I know, for example, if we look at the Great Barrier Reef provisions that are going on in Australia, just as an example, that money is going into the hands of foreign researchers. It doesn't go to the reef or in any way cleaning up the water surrounding the reef, which, by the way, are perfectly clean and our reef is doing better than it ever has. You never hear that in the headline. The money is going to bureaucracies. And that is a huge problem if you care about the environment, because as you said before, pollution is a growing problem in the Pacific. Most of the waste in the Pacific is not coming from New South Wales as plastic straws. It's coming from Indonesia and the Philippines, where their rivers literally pour millions of cubic tons of, plastic straight into the Pacific Ocean. No one is addressing that problem.
And no one, including the eco-warriors, were concerned about those wretched face masks used during the pandemic, billions of which are now rotting in landfill because they can't be recycled and they are polluting the oceans. Alex, a quick one before you go. It's a Friday, and I think I've got what you would perceive to be a Friday good news story. World Athletics have prohibited biological males who identify as female from participating in competition within athletics. Your response?
Finally, some common sense. As soon as we started saying that men can transition and become women, we ended up with a problem, because a man will always be a biological man and a woman will always be a biological woman, and the two should never have to face each other in a sex-segregated sport. So finally, this is just a win for common sense that we've known for a very long time.
However, does this not exclude trans women? Is it not terribly hurtful that they can't participate because you're effectively not respecting their life choice and the manner by which they identify?
Sport is a life choice. So if they want to play professional sport, then you cannot take drugs of any kind. You cannot alter your physiology of any kind. If your entire life is about sport, then you play as your segregated sex, which is your right to do. If you decide that your life is more about your gender transition, well, then unfortunately, sport has to fall by the wayside. And every human being makes sacrifices like that in their daily lives for all of their choices. And so it doesn't invalidate and it should not threaten women's ability to compete fairly in sport.
Alex Marshall, great to have you back on the show. Always enjoy reading you in The Spectator Australia. Alex Marshall, their columnist and journalist on net zero. What do you think? Is net zero happening at the expense of pollution? Mark at gbnews.uk. Lots more to get through before 9 o'clock, including rising house prices. Is home ownership still an option? Is it worth it? Or is it now becoming an overpriced con? We'll discuss that next.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel. Well, a big response to many of our conversations tonight on Mark Dolan Tonight. This from John. Hi, Mark. Brilliant show, as always. I love good, honest journalism. I think slippery Sunak has sold Northern Ireland down the river. We're in the EU through the back door. How about this on net zero? Is net zero happening at the expense of pollution? This from John. Mark, you're quite right about pollution. All causes for protest have a sell-by date. Not so long ago, all protests were about single-use plastic. Going back some years, there was the campaign for nuclear disarmament. Whatever happened to CND? Trendy outrage is transient, and currently it's all about net zero. How about this from Steve? Mark, all that net zero has done is spawn a brand new industry. It is a complete sham, says Steve. He is not having it. There you go. And what about this? Not pulling his punches. Nick has emailed the show. Hello, Nick. How are you? Mark at gbnews.uk. Hi, Mark. Sunak has betrayed Brexit with his Windsor surrender. He has betrayed the economy and the British people with higher taxes in his socialist budget. And he's doing nothing to genuinely stop the migrant invasion. The Tories are exactly the same as Labour. There's no reason to worry that Reform UK will help Labour get in. They are already in government. I will vote Reform to punish Sunak and the Tory party that has betrayed us all. A very powerful email there from Nick. Look, we've debated net zero a lot. Of course, the majority of scientists, experts would argue that the planet is heating up, that we've got too much carbon, that it's an emergency. But look, on Mark Dolan Tonight, it's all about opinions. So keep yours coming. Mark at gbnews.uk. Now, the Bank of England have raised interest rates for the 11th time in a row, taking the bank rate to 4.25%. Despite the turmoil in the banking sector. Some economists predict that interest rates could now be at their peak, but others worry that rates will rise again to 4.5% by this summer. So with the cost of mortgage rates spiralling, is there still a case for home ownership in this country? And is the idea that every Brit's home is their castle ultimately going to be a thing of the past? Well, I'm delighted to welcome 2 of my favourite viewers to the show. That's right, the most important contributors to Mark Dolan Tonight are my viewers and listeners. And tonight, we welcome Andrew in Essex and Sue in Cheshire. Hello, one and all. Sue, has the dream of home ownership gone up in smoke?
No, I don't think so. I think, I'm old enough to have lived through the last time we had huge, very high mortgage rates, which are a lot higher than they are now. And I think as this crisis abates, the interest rates will go down. Before the 2008 catastrophe, they were about 4%. The mortgage rate was about 4%. And I think they'll get back to that. I think the problem is more the lack of housing for people to buy. And I think George Osborne's got a lot to answer for there in the past, because in 2010 he made a right mess of the housing market. His second home levy, he let the people who actually have second homes off, a lot of them, by not having to pay the council tax, by letting them say that it's a to let, holiday let. He made people who were actually just buying houses to refurbish and then put out back on the market, they counted as a second home, which is ludicrous. They're going to be a first home for somebody else, and all that did was put those houses up 3% before you'd even done anything to them. And landlords, he's pushed most of them out the market, and there's loads of people on housing lists for the councils who can't get properties to rent because he's pushed them all out. It's very unfair to say they shouldn't have their mortgages as an expense against their expenses, because if you say a laundrette or something and you borrowed to buy more washing machines, you could use that. You could count that interest as your expense. Why shouldn't a landlord do the same, simply because his assets are properties? And at the same time, not only do they have to not get that end, they also have to pay capital gains tax at the other end. So Osborne's premise that, he was levelling up for local, for private residents who had their own mortgage and landlords was ridiculous. So I think if we've got over 700,000 houses in this country that are lying unused or derelict, and if they handled that properly, you could have 700,000 houses back in use a lot quicker than you can build a lot of housing estates that don't really have good quality housing in them anyway.
George Osborne with a lot to answer for. Andrew in Essex, is the dream of home ownership in peril?
I don't actually think it is, because obviously nowadays there are various options. So I am a shared ownership homeowner, and this scheme, enables people to buy from as little as 25%, in some cases 40%, 60% and 80%. Obviously you need to save hard to be able to get onto the ladder, but once you are on the ladder, it is a lot more affordable than renting. And you do also have a lot of support in terms of, I know for myself, with the service charge, I have a window cleaner come once a month. They maintain the building and also have a gardener. With my own disability, I wouldn't be particularly good at gardening, and someone comes and does that for a very nominal service charge. And also, I think that if people were to cut back initially to get onto the ladder, rather than going to expensive coffee shops, going somewhere like Greg's, you can get a bacon roll and a latte for £2.50. There's ways and means, but I also think that actually, if people see it as an investment, what do you want? If you want to do something, and there is a way. My kind of generation, my grandparents were quite influential when I was growing up. If you wanted something, you would save for it. I started working at 16. I had a part-time job at Sainsbury's, and I've worked in various jobs over the last sort of nearly 24 years. And I've worked in education since May 2009. And I actually do think it is going to be achievable. And interest rates are gone up, but, there are fixed mortgage deals that you can get with the bank. So, you can have a fixed deal for 5 years, and then obviously you've got a bit of stability, you've got opportunity to develop in your career. And if you are able to progress, and find ways of doing it. I think, though, that the interest rates are not massively high. I can remember when I was working at 16, the interest rates were, 6%? I'm talking quite a long time ago. So, it's gone up 0.25%. But, there are a lot of people like myself who don't have to commute for work now. So if you take that into consideration, it's a kind of a swings and roundabout. We go out for a social gathering once a quarter now, And COVID has changed things, and being able to work from home is it does save you money. So, and I guess it's down to people's choice. Some people may want to live in London. I know it's a lot more expensive, whereas I live in a commutable distance rather. Now I can get a fast train into Liverpool Street for 35 minutes.
Okay,
but it is good to live here. So it's kind of.
Andrew, it's a very interesting debate, and Greggs will be very grateful for the publicity. £2.50 for a bacon butty and a latte. My God, I wish it was open now. I'd hot-foot it during the news headlines. Sue and Andrew, great to have you back on the show. We'll catch up soon. Coming up next, in my big opinion, 3 years on from the first lockdown, my reaction to the moment the free world lost its mind. We were mad to go along with it. My Mark Meets guest is the priest and best-selling author Fergus Butler-Galley, who tells me how God can survive the 21st century and why priests are no angels. In the big story, as the people of France revolt over pensions reforms, why do us Brits take every government policy lying down? Lots to get through. My big opinions next. Don't go anywhere.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel. It's Friday night, it's 9 o'clock, and this is Mark Dolan Tonight. In my big opinion, 3 years on from the first lockdown, my reaction to the moment the free world lost its mind. We were mad to go along with it. My Mark Meets guest is the priest and best-selling author Fergus Butler-Galley, who tells me how God can survive the 21st century and why priests are no angels. In the big story, as the people of France revolt over pensions reform, why do us Brits take everything lying down? Does this country need a bit of revolutionary spirit when it comes to unpopular government measures? Big guests, big stories, big opinions, a lively 2 hours to come, including my big opinion. But first, the headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Mark, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The French president says King Charles visiting France would have lacked sense when protests are happening across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King and Queen consort were due to arrive on Sunday as part of a week-long trip to Europe. But President Emmanuel Macron has defended postponing their first state visit, suggesting instead a date in the early summer. The Windsor Framework has been formally adopted by the UK and the EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier today to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement for Northern Ireland. That's after MPs voted in favour of the storm break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values during a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu's in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation of tensions in the West Bank. Well, outside Downing Street today, demonstrators described Netanyahu's controversial reforms as unacceptable. Security guards at Heathrow Airport will go ahead with strikes over the Easter holiday after talks over pay have failed. The airport says it has contingency plans in place to deal with the 10-day walkout and keep it running as normal. Heathrow has said it's offered a 10% pay increase to its workers. Ofsted says schools inspections will continue despite teaching unions calling for them to be suspended. 3 unions say they should be paused while a review of the system is carried out. But the Ofsted chief says it wouldn't be in the best interests of children. It's after head teacher Ruth Perry took her own life in January whilst awaiting her school report. Head teacher Sophie Greenaway says the mental health of staff should be a priority. And the Premier League has referred Everton to an independent commission to question reported losses of over £370 million. Everton's loss during the 2021-22 season allegedly breaches the league's profit and financial sustainability rules, allowing clubs to lose a maximum of £105 million over a 3-year period or face sanctions. In a club statement, Everton said they were disappointed by the Premier League's decision. TV, online, DAB Plus radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's over to Mark Dolan tonight.
My thanks to Tatiana Sanchez, who returns in an hour's time. Welcome to Mark Dolan Tonight. In my big opinion, 3 years on from the first lockdown, my reaction to the moment the free world lost its mind. We were mad to go along with it. My Mark Meets guest is the priest and best-selling author Fergus Butler-Galley, who tells me how God can survive the 21st century and why priests are no angels. In the big story, as the people of France revolt over pensions reform, why do us Brits take everything lying down? Does this country need a bit of revolutionary spirit when it comes to unpopular government measures? In my take at 10, Tesco are reducing the value of club card points. Whatever happened to every little helps? There's my club card. I'm furious that it's lost its value. It's a shocking own goal, and I'll be dealing with Tesco in an hour's time. Mark Dolan Tonight is the home of the papers, with tomorrow's front pages at exactly 10:30 sharp, with 3 top pundits who haven't been told what to say and who don't follow the script. Tonight with me until 11, 3 top pundits: Henry Hill, Stephanie Tetchy and Peter Edwards. And tonight I'll be asking, have the Tories turned the corner? Should woke lawyers who won't prosecute eco-protesters be struck off? And should parents ban their children from using social media? plus your emails, especially the spicy ones, mark@gbnews.uk. Now, this programme's got a golden rule. It's a bulletproof rule. It is my absolute red line on the show. We don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it. Lots to get through. Let's start with my big opinion. Three years ago this morning, following an announcement from Boris Johnson the night before, we awoke for the first time to an entire country shut down, immobilised and imprisoned. It was the moment a supposedly free country discarded its values and centuries of scientific wisdom to pursue a Chinese Communist Party-inspired medieval policy of locking people in their own homes with the aim of stopping a potentially nasty but largely mild respiratory virus. What's the point in having values based around democracy and freedom if you don't govern by them, particularly in a crisis? A pandemic, a war, a natural disaster, an economic crisis. These are the moments when the values of your country should come to the fore, not be thrown away. Restricting our movements, covering our faces, bullying us into taking a novel medication, closing once viable businesses, damaging children's mental and physical health, and diminishing their life chances with school closures. All of this horror was policy. Printing money, which has led to the inflation we're now suffering, was policy as well. Also, the borrowing of £500 billion to pay healthy people to stay at home, the creation of a budget deficit where more goes out than comes in, and the eye-watering national debt, which now stands at over £2 trillion, was all policy. And here's the kicker. It didn't bloody work. None of this carnage, the cost of living crisis, massive government, business and household debts, a mental health crisis, an NHS waiting list of 7 million people, none of it can be seen or proven to have moved the dial in relation to the spread of COVID. As I said throughout the pandemic, virus gonna virus. Now, I supported the Great Barrington Declaration signed by top medics and scientists like Professor Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford University in the States, who urged for focused protection of vulnerable groups, allowing those who face no mortal threat from the virus to continue working and contribute to the economy, which pays for the public services that we all value so highly. Now, I've said these measures didn't work, and I'll happily grant you that that is a debating matter. Plenty disagree with me. But it doesn't take a genius to look at the difference between countries which had strict COVID measures, and with them the resultant damage, versus countries that did not, which takes us to Sweden, who did not lock down or mask their citizens or close schools or shut businesses. Far from suffering Armageddon, Sweden boasts among the lowest rates of excess deaths in Europe since 2020, with excess deaths being the ultimate metric. After all, we were told that all of this bollocks was to do with saving lives. Sweden ought to have a far higher death toll. Or states in America like Florida that lifted measures early, but they do not. Name me one country in the world that didn't have strict COVID measures which has topped the global rankings of sad COVID deaths. You won't find it. As the WhatsApp messages from Matt Hancock proved, COVID measures were about managing headlines, not public health, with those ridiculous mask mandates, especially for kids, being purely political rather than medical. They covered our faces to cover their arses, with a being seen to do something policy throughout the pandemic. Well, what did they do? They destroyed the country by trying to defeat a virus. How arrogant, reckless and deluded can you get? The brave medics, scientists, broadcasters and others who called this madness out, who questioned all of these policies, who spoke of the long-term economic and health consequences, well, they were shouted down, abused, ostracised and sometimes lost their careers. Except in my view, they've been proved right. Throughout the pandemic from day one, I questioned the wisdom of this wild experiment, culminating in my destruction of a face mask at the hands of a pair of scissors on my old radio show. It created one of the viral moments of the pandemic, no pun intended, and it broke the internet. I rest easy in my bed in the knowledge that I'm on record as having called out this madness. These protests by myself and plenty of others, which have aged better than Jane Fonda, were all sadly in vain. The government, egged on by Sage and Her Majesty's opposition, pursued lockdown after lockdown after lockdown when it became increasingly clear the measures were highly destructive and questionable in their efficacy. Our compliance was part of the problem, and it's been reported that Number 10 were amazed. They were incredulous that the public were willing to go along with the restrictions. Well, more fool us. We complied with the restrictions to make them end, but our compliance meant they never did. 3 years ago this week, the free world lost its mind. In my view, it's the biggest public health mistake in history, and its legacy will be decades of diminished, damaged and lost lives. All of the economic, societal and health carnage we're now going through, including 140,000 so-called ghost children who left school never to come back, is because we tried to stop a virus that in the end everyone got anyway. 3 weeks to flatten the curve became 3 years to flatten the country. Never again. There you go. Now, what do you think? The government would argue that vaccine mandates, masking and lockdowns saved thousands of lives and prevented the NHS from being overwhelmed. Support for these measures came from the vast majority of scientists and medical experts. It's not my view. I think it was a mistake, but most experts would say I'm wrong. What's your view? Mark at gbnews.uk. Let's get reaction now from my top pundits on Mark Dolan tonight. Delighted to have Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill, journalist and broadcaster Stephanie Tecci, and former editor of Labour List, the wonderful, the one and only, Peter Edwards. Stephanie, can I start with you? 3 years on, a very unhappy anniversary.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about just the irony of it all, Mark, the fact that we've had our former Prime Minister now accepting responsibility for flouting his own lockdown rules and for his own Partygate scandals. And, you know, I've always seen the country, Britain, as a liberal country, and we rightly gave up our freedoms during the pandemic for the greater good, to help our fellow man. But now, 3 years on, I think to myself, was it really worth it? We've got a crippling economy now. The NHS is on its knees. Countless people didn't get diagnosed for conditions and have died, so that's been a pandemic in itself. And the mental health crisis, people who needed help were left isolated and to their own devices where they actually needed society then. So I think, you know what, I just hope in my lifetime again I never have to hear the word lockdown. I hope us Brits can become a bit more like the French and just say no. And, you know, just really react to what the government tries to give us. I don't think they could ever try an experiment like that. We've done it for the greater good, but now we are paying for the price.
There you go, the bilingual Stephanie Tecci. Peter Edwards, 3 weeks to flatten the curve became 3 years to flatten the country.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's really a fair analysis at all, because 3 years on, we're in a remarkably different position, even from the end of the year.
A disastrous position.
No, I wouldn't say that, but clearly we've got a cost of living crisis. But, I mean, I don't want to go off on a party political rant, but clearly,
go for it.
The cost of living crisis, you know, the roots of that are 10 years in the making under Conservative
Nothing
rule.
to do with paying healthy people to stay at home on and off for 2.5 years, borrowing £500 billion?
Well, borrowing is clearly a massive issue. But remember, George Osborne, you know, well before COVID, borrowed more at that point than any Chancellor in British history. And he was meant to be a man controlling the public finances. He borrowed more than any Chancellor ever.
Nothing comparable to COVID.
So there was a borrowing problem, there was a cost of living problem before we had COVID. But before you go on, I'll just leave you with one thought. There was, even at the end of lockdown 3, majority public support and cross-party support for lockdowns.
And the public were wrong, and we're now paying the price.
Well, I wouldn't say that at all. And there was majority support, but we'll all form our own judgment. I think it was the right thing to do.
Henry, I just think that we have the data now. You can look at countries that had strict COVID measures versus countries that either couldn't afford to or chose not to. There's no difference. And in some cases, the stricter countries had worse outcomes.
So obviously we definitely got some things very wrong about the way that we handled COVID. I think especially with regards to things like schools, it's quite clear that we were getting those cost-benefit analyses wrong. But I think the important thing to remember is that it's not just the COVID rules aren't the only variable. There's also other things like the state of other countries' healthcare systems. And I think the fact is, especially early on, I think the way it maybe lasted too long, but early on, we run the NHS at almost full capacity at all times. There's no slack in the system. So if we hadn't taken measures to try and flatten the curve, the result would have been a huge demand for NHS services at the start of the pandemic of very vulnerable people whom we would not have been able to treat. And it may be that overall, over the life of the pandemic, roughly the same number of people would have died and we would have avoided some of the long-term consequences in terms of mental health and all the rest of it. But we would, in those early weeks, I think, have had a lot of people dying in NHS hospitals because they couldn't get in. And I just don't think that was politically survivable for any government, regardless of the kind of cold.
And now we've got a
benefit.
waiting list of 7 million people. We've got a cancer care crisis. And in the end, COVID tragically focused on older people, average age of death, sadly, over 80. It was a disease whose threat was very clear in terms of the population. Quick question from all three of you. Henry, do you think the public would swallow future lockdowns?
I do. If you look at the polling, the British people are generally very on board with this kind of thing. Whether you agree with them or not, it's a very authoritarian country.
Yeah, clearly the government need a big comms campaign around it. And personally, and I think in much Labour Party, we hope we'll never have another lockdown. No one wants it. But there was public support, and there would be again if there was another national crisis, which this certainly was.
Stephanie, what do you think? Would the public accept future measures? Would you?
I wouldn't accept future measures. I know I should.
Would you take to the streets?
Maybe, but as a broadcaster, I don't think I'll get away with it. Maybe I'll be interviewing the people who are taken to the streets. But I think, you know, in the government's defence, no one had lived through a pandemic before. It was new territory for us. But now that we had 3 lockdowns, I think if there was to be a 4th one, I think there needs to be a better measure and a better strategy ahead for the public.
OK, brilliant stuff. Well, coming up next in the big story, the French have taken to the streets. They're not happy about changes to pension arrangements. Why do we take everything lying down in this country? Should Brits be more like the French? That's next.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Well, a big reaction to my big opinion, and it was all about the 3-year anniversary of the first COVID lockdown, the moment the free world lost its mind. This from Janet. Mark, you said it so well. I agree with every word of your big opinion. Shaking my head about the shenanigans of the last 3 years. Take care. That's from Janet. Thank you, Janet. Jackie says, hi, Mark, your big opinion was spot on as usual. The government has destroyed our country, destroyed businesses and destroyed our young people's education. We can never believe the BS that they spew ever again. And as for the NHS, what a joke. Everything was to protect the NHS, but they won't protect us. Lockdowns. You call out lockdowns, says an unnamed emailer, and restrictions and masks, but you still took the jabs. Duplicitous Mr. Dolan. Yeah, well, I was a victim of vaccine tyranny. Let me tell you, I wanted to travel, so I had to get the jabs. Never again. And how about this? Pat says, Mark, the COVID measures did work because the objective was to bankrupt the country. If you owe $3 trillion, you forfeit your sovereignty. That's from Pat. And Steve says, Mark, those measures saved lives, end of. OK, folks, brilliant stuff. Now, we asked on Twitter, 3 years after Boris Johnson first shut the country down, were lockdowns a mistake? Well, the votes are in. 75% say yes, lockdowns were a mistake. 25% say no. Now, King Charles has had to postpone his planned visit to France amid widespread and, at times, violent street protests against the raising of the pension retirement age to 67. Many are shocked by the loss of law and order on the streets of Paris, but others see it as an exercise in democracy and people power. Given the fact that in Britain we've seen the pension retirement age even higher than what's being proposed by Macron in France, without so much as a squeak from the public, do we need to be more French and stand up to governments inflicting unpopular policies on the public? Do us Brits take too much lying down? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome the leader of the Heritage Party, David Curtin, and former UKIP MEP, Godfrey Bloom. We'll start with you, David Curtin. Do you think the Brits are too compliant?
I think on this issue with pensions, I don't think it's something that people see as imminent and is going to make an imminent, immediate detrimental effect to their finances. Whereas, you know, in France, I think it is. The pensions are going up from 62 to 64. I don't know over what time frame. Here in the UK, they're going up. They went up a couple of years ago. They're going up again later this decade. But people seem to be resigned to this. But when you do have things that have an imminent, immediate effect, then people do go out on the streets in this country and they do protest. I mean, there were the poll tax riots we know about in 1990. There were the energy price protests in 2000. I think also another example of where people went out on the streets is what I was involved in over the last 3 years in protesting for freedom, the freedom rallies against lockdowns and so on, and against vaccine mandates. There were hundreds of thousands of people month after month after month in London and around the country going out to protest about that, but they were largely peaceful, except when the riot police went in and attacked the protesters. And that's what we're seeing in France. I think actually the vast majority of the people who are protesting about pensions, which is a real issue to the French people, you're seeing the violence there, not from the people, but from the riot police are going in, and they are really being very, very aggressive and doing things that should not be happening in a Western democracy.
Indeed. Godfrey Bloom, what's your reaction to what's happening in France and parallels with how the British respond to unpopular policies?
Well, David, of course, is right. He's mentioned the poll tax riots. You could also mention the Liverpool riots, the Moss Side riots. And, of course, if it is violent, here's the sad thing. If it's violent, when the Liverpool riots happened, Michael Heseltine rushed up there with his checkbook as soon as his little legs could carry him. And when the poll tax riots took place, they were violent. and poll tax was abandoned. And now there are it seems there could be 9 million people taking to the streets all over France, not just Paris, incidentally. Now, this is rather amusing, actually. I had a little chuckle about this earlier. I wonder who explained to King Charles that he couldn't go because there were millions of people on the streets protesting. Because he would have said, no, surely not. I watch the BBC regularly, and it can't be so because none of this has been reported. And so I wonder who broke that news to him, poor little fellow, who lives in a bubble of sycophants round him, watching only the BBC. And so consequently, he will be sitting at home now rather bewildered. So I think perhaps you might refer to Rudyard Kipling's wonderful poem, Beware the Anglo-Saxon. We are slow to take off. We're very slow for violence. We don't like that sort of thing in this country, and that's probably because nobody's invaded us for 1,000 years until, I suppose, possibly recently Dover. And so we tend to be a little bit complacent. We are a complacent nation, and I think that's a problem. I also it might be interested in this, David and Mark, yourselves. I decided, because I couldn't understand a lot of this, I did a Smithsonian psychology course over the winter. Long distance, one of these courses, to try and work out why people think as they do. And Mark, you just spoke to people on the sofa there who simply refuse to join the dots. All the evidence is there now. Everything is there that you need statistically. The data is out, but they're still sticking to this ludicrous idea that it was all, broadly speaking, a good idea and there was nothing to do. They couldn't do anything about it. They're also suggesting it was a one-off. It was a first, which is ridiculous, because I was around in 1968 when there was a much bigger flu crisis with more deaths, and it was much worse. So, yes, we had lived through it before, and we handled it just like the Swedes handled it this time round, and it was better. So we have a nation that doesn't join the dots. And in my Smithsonian course that I did, apparently they say, and it's probably a Western European thing, or it could be a global thing, I don't know, that 80% of the people will swallow just about everything that the authority tells them to do. That, they just will swallow all that. And they were the sort of people sitting on your bench earlier. They will believe anything the government says if it's delivered with a straight face. And this is the problem that we have. 20% of people don't. I took no notice of the lockdown. I didn't have the jabs. I never wore a mask. And I built a pub on the back of my small holding right the way through all the lockdowns. And the whole village came and we got pissed. And that's the way we handled it, because I'm one of the 20% who doesn't let people tell me what to do.
Fair enough. Now, of course, I have a responsibility as a national broadcaster to say that we must uphold the rule of law. You don't break the law, because that's the great thing about this country. But, David, how do you respond to what Godfrey has just said there about the Brits being too compliant?
Well, I think Godfrey is right, actually. I mean, I think we were far too compliant through the lockdown period in particular, and people went along with laws which were repugnant to our constitution and to our fundamental freedoms. We have the fundamental freedoms to have the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest. And I think there is a place for civil disobedience when a government starts to act in a tyrannical manner. We don't want to live in an Orwellian society, and that's what started to be brought in at the beginning of lockdown, and then later on with the vaccine passports and no jab, no job rules, where we know care home workers were put out of a job, and then they tried to get nurses and doctors in the NHS put out of a job as well, just for exercising their right not to be injected with an experimental injection of mRNA. And if that is what the government's doing, then, actually we have a duty to freedom. We have a duty to ourselves and to the generations coming after us to protest against the government. But the government says you're not allowed to protest. You're not allowed to assemble. They actually made it illegal to gather in groups of more than 6 at some point, and sometimes even more than 2 people. I nearly got a £200 fine for talking to 2 other people in Richmond Park in February 2021. I remember remember it well. I didn't in the end, and most of these fines that were given out were squashed by the courts because they realised that they were just repugnant to every standard and common law that exists. But we do have a duty sometimes to engage in civil disobedience when these kind of things happen, and we do have a tradition of that in this country. And as Godfrey says, we don't get to that place quickly, but when people realise that something needs to be done to uphold and maintain our way of life and our freedoms and the values that our nation is built on, then it's right to do that thing. I absolutely think it is right to protest in that way.
David Curtin and Godfrey Bloom, a brilliant debate. What do you think? Mark at gbnews.uk. Of course, it's worth pointing out that the vaccine was tested and approved by the authorities. Many would argue it's now the most tested vaccine in history, given the fact that the billions of people around the world have had the jab. But it's all about opinions. Let me know what yours is. Mark at gbnews.uk. Coming up with the pundits, a few big topics to get through, including should woke lawyers who won't prosecute eco-protesters be struck off? Should parents ban their children from using social media? And have the Tories turned the corner? That's next.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
3 years on, many of you not happy about the COVID restrictions. Of course, it was yesterday, the 3-year anniversary of the first lockdown. David says, good evening, Mark. Your guest, Godfrey Bloom, is 100% right in all he says. And I'm one of the 20% who did not follow the rules. It's about time we started looking at the source of all this. It's not the MPs. It was too orchestrated to be the MPs. Let's go to the top of this pyramid and expose it. David, thank you for that. Steve says, Godfrey is now my new hero. I've been campaigning against this nonsense for years. I've seen the proof. Keep up the good work. That's Steve in France, where, of course, they've lost law and order. Here to you, Mark, and to Godfrey. Especially loved Godfrey's comment, I wish we lived in his village. His pub in his orchard sounded great. And David as well, I agree with every word that you've said about the management of the pandemic. A complete disaster. That from Faye. Keep those emails coming. Mark at gbnews.uk. My pundits tonight, the best in the business. Journalist and broadcaster Stephanie Tecci. Political commentator and former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards. And the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Now, the Tories could win the next general election, according to the editor of The Spectator magazine, Fraser Nelson. This comes as a Delta poll survey revealed the Conservatives are up 8 points on 35 points. Rishi Sunak's success in sealing a Brexit deal and the government's small boats policy seems to be helping. So is Fraser Nelson right? Have the Tories turned a corner? Henry?
You have to hope so. I think it's important to stress, of course, that some of this recovery is simply that under Liz Truss, the Tories really did make a concerted effort to get their polling as low as possible. And to an extent, Rishi Sunak is benefiting from a reversion to the mean, perhaps. But he has achieved some significant progress. The Windsor framework is not perfect, but it's a better deal than many people thought we would get. And he seems to be making progress on small boats. But there's a long way to go until the election. The Windsor framework has not brought Northern Ireland devolution back, so that could yet blow up in his face, and he may not actually get the boat crossings down.
Well, Dan Hodges has been very busy on Twitter today. There's a clear trend, he says, Henry, developing here. Labour's lead is still substantial, but it's clear that Rishi Sunak is beginning to claw back some ground. So the Election Max UK poll via Omnisys from the 23rd and 24th of March says that Labour on 44%, which is down 2, the Tories up 4 to 29.
The Tory polling is recovering, and Rishi Sunak can get a lot of the credit for that. And if he can keep it up over the next year, then it could be a much closer election than anyone are expecting. I still think at the moment that we should expect some kind of Labour victory. But it's also, if you look at the way the government is actually running the budget, pushing all sorts of brutal spending decisions into 2025, 2026, if you actually look at Jeremy Hunt's budget. Yeah. So he's not governing as if he expects to win the election. And if the Tories do pull off a surprise win, then all of the decisions Jeremy Hunt's made over the last few weeks are going to come back to bite them really, really hard.
Peter, is Keir Starmer looking over his shoulder?
I think Labour have never been complacent, and that's something I've maybe said on this show. Even when Labour had a lead of up to 25 points, that really masked the fact there are a lot of undecideds within that polling. When you strip out the undecided, the election always looks a bit closer. When I worked for a shadow cabinet minister, Ed Miliband frequently had a lead well over 10 points, and I think we all remember that experience. In terms of number of seats in House of Commons, Labour went backwards under Ed Miliband. So I've always felt it's a contest. I think Henry sounded a little bit fatalistic. It's always going to be a tough fight for Labour because Labour's, you talked about the Liz Truss starting point in the polling, but in terms of the parliamentary mathematics, Labour's starting point is abysmal because we did so badly under Corbyn. So I think it is a contest. I think Rishi Sunak, I disagree with him on lots of things. I think cost of living is a disaster, but he is calm, he is sober, he is rational. The Northern Ireland Windsor framework is a step forward for the whole United Kingdom. I think people are suffering big time in terms of cost of living, but Labour never have been complacent, and it's back to being a contest, isn't it?
Stephanie, going to get to your story next, but briefly on this. I wonder whether this leads to a messy hung parliament in a year's time.
Gosh, we've tried a hung parliament before and it didn't work in the past. And I think right now what this country needs is a clear direction. We either need to be with one party or the other, and I think we need a party who's got a strong vision. And at the moment, it's looking like the Conservatives, I think.
There you go. Now, approximately 120 top lawyers are set to sign a declaration of conscience to avoid prosecuting climate zealots in courts on behalf of clients working in oil and gas. The leading barristers have been accused of undermining the Fair Legal Representation Convention. So, should woke lawyers who won't prosecute Extinction Rebellion protesters be struck off, Stephanie?
No, I don't think they should be struck off, actually, because I think before any of us decides what profession we're going to do in life, we're human beings, and I like to think human beings have a conscience, and I think, you know what, it's actually quite admirable that these lawyers are actually standing
for not doing their job.
No,
You can't pick
Mark.
and choose.
But
This is the politicisation of the judiciary.
But I would rather them own what they don't want to get involved with, and if it's to do with climate and it's a cause that's close to their heart, I think it's better for them to say, actually, we don't want to be involved in that, and leave it to the job to the people who do want to do it.
Henry Hill, prosecutors won't prosecute. Schools won't accept Ofsted inspections. The country's imploding.
It's definitely a very challenging time. This is, I think, a dangerous move. It's not necessarily right to strike them off, as long as it doesn't impede the functioning of the justice system. You know, it is perfectly possible that they're refusing to take these cases. There will be other barristers who will, and they will benefit. But if it's the case that people who deserve and need legal representation to work through our court system can't get it, then yes, the government would have to act. But it also, the cab rank principle is important, because when people attack someone for defending an alleged murderer or an alleged rapist, they can point to the cab rank principle and they can say, look, everybody deserves fair representation. The moment you start picking and choosing, that defence cracks, and all of a sudden lawyers are going to be being hammered for defending people who may have done evil things but who do deserve legal representation, and that's, I think, where the real danger here is.
OK, now the pop star Pink, who is a mother of two, admitted in a recent interview that she will not allow her 11-year-old daughter to have a phone until she can prove social media is good for her. She explained further it was to keep her children's innocence. So should parents ban their children from using social media? Peter?
I was hoping so much you'd ask me about barristers and a nice, sensible topic like that, rather than...
Because you are a father to how many?
I'm a father of one.
Brilliant. Can you say the age?
Six last weekend.
All right, so it's a little boy, isn't it?
That's right.
Chip
Had
off
a big
the old
party.
block. Handsome little devil. Saw him in the corridors of GB News the other day. Fine lad. Congratulations. Will he be deprived of a mobile phone when he's older?
Well, I'll spare him the ordeal of talking about him personally on national telly. But in terms of kids more broadly, I think there are real risks that perhaps, you know, anyone of our generation didn't have. I have to admit, I think we're all in our 30s or 40s. Well, I think we're all addicted to a certain extent, aren't we, to our mobile phones?
Yeah.
And we didn't imagine our social life or our work life being like that. But we are a bit addicted and we feel a bit jittery when the device is taken away from us.
I'd love to get rid of mine.
So I think the longer we can keep our kids away from that, the better. And I think TikTok has been in the headlines for the kind of national security and Chinese element this week. But also there's another element to it, which is intellectual junk food, stuffing you with more and more and more. It does rot your brain a little bit.
Well, do we need a government sort of advertising campaign to get all of us off our smartphones, Stephanie?
No, I don't think. I think it's gone too far now, Mark. I think it's become such a deadly addiction now. Like, even when I'm playing with my godchildren from age 5 and above, they're glued to their phones, they're glued to their iPads. It's like communication doesn't stimulate them anymore unless it's coming from a screen. So to then have the government then to promote it to us again via a screen, it's gone too late. It's up to parents to lay down the laws. I believe it always starts at home. Kids will obey what their parents say. I think when we expose our kids to social media, they're now, you know, at the hands of online bullying, whether it's been groomed by gangs. And you've seen cases before in the past, Mark, of youngsters who are dying by suicide because they cannot achieve this perfection which is being made out on social media, which is all fake.
I would ask Henry what he thinks, but he's currently on Snapchat, so better crack on. With his besties, coming up in the next hour, my Mark Meets guest is the priest and best-selling author Fergus Butler-Galley, who tells me how God can survive the 21st century and why priests are no angels. See you in 3.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes & Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway, Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel. With the French rioting on the streets, are the Brits too compliant? Chris says, Mark, it's not compliance, it's discipline. Those of us who survived the war know that we should respect the leadership when we're threatened. Those clever hindsight smart asses who know better would have lost us everything in previous years. Anne says GB News is as bad as the Ramonas who won't accept Brexit. Just move on. No one in the world had experienced a pandemic of that proportion. Lockdowns happened, people refused vaccines, and some lost jobs. Decisions have consequences. Fortunately, the majority accepted the reason for the jab and took it. Doesn't bear thinking about the outcome if they had not. And Wayne says, Mark, in terms of those lawyers who will not prosecute eco-protesters, all the lawyers who refuse to prosecute net zero zealots should be struck off. And who's going to win the next election? Well, Richard has the answer. Richard says, Mark, the Tories will win a majority. All the polls are wrong. Look at the betting sites for a real gauge of momentum. Sunak's odds are coming down every week. Keep those opinions coming. Mark at gbnews.uk. It's time for this. Yes, it's time now for Mark Meets, in which I speak to the biggest names in the world of politics, showbiz and beyond, and those who simply have a big story to tell. Tonight, the priest and best-selling author Fergus Butler Galley, who tells me how God can survive the 21st century and why priests are no angels. The book is called Touching Cloth, Confessions and Communion of a Young Priest, and it's out now. And here is my well-thumbed copy. Cracking late-night reading. I've woken Mrs. Dolan up more than once with my laughter. Reverend, welcome to GB News.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on the book. It's your third.
It is indeed, yes. I'm not sure how that happened, but it did.
Are your sermons very entertaining?
No, they're deeply boring.
So,
Sure they're not. How many gags? What's your gag rate for a sermon?
Well, I try and make sure they're not exclusively gags. I try and make sure that gags have a point.
There's a little bit of the man above in there. Bit of Jesus.
Yeah, a bit of Jesus. You've got to sort of... gags are there to lull people into a false sense of security, to make them think they're going to enjoy themselves, and then you hit them with the
But
stuff.
the sermon is an art form, isn't it? It's obviously to sort of spread the spiritual message, the message of faith and community and all those wonderful things. But you've got to hold their attention, haven't you?
Absolutely. And if you look back in the time of Shakespeare, you know, when actors were at the Globe, the managers would send them to pulpits to go and see the preachers of the time, because they were the people who could hold an audience. And they said, go and learn from them. I think now we've probably flipped the other way round, and really we should be sending clergy to go and learn from actors how to actually gain people's attention. Because if they're not listening, you could be preaching the most marvellous message in the entire world, but it's going to go nowhere.
How long ago, roughly, were you ordained?
I was ordained 5 years ago, 6 years ago.
And how have you changed as a man in those 5 years?
Oh, in ways that I can't even count.
I mean, you've grown a beard.
I've grown a beard.
You've got three best-selling books.
Well, my waistline has expanded as well. There's a lot of cake, a lot of sort of that sort of thing.
Well, that's obligatory, because a lot of those are gifts, aren't they? The biscuits, the cakes.
They are. I had a parishioner in Liverpool who made the most astonishing lemon curd, and I tried to sort of limit myself to it, you know, sort of a little bit every week, and jars would fly out the window. So, yes, I'm larger, I think, but happier. It really has been the most important thing I've ever done, and it has given my life a degree of meaning and been a fulfilment of a calling, really, that I don't think could have happened in any other way.
Did you deliberate over taking the leap and becoming ordained?
Absolutely, and I'm sort of slightly dubious of anyone who doesn't. I think it should be the most difficult decision of your life. I think it should be something that really you weigh up. It should almost be something you don't want to do. And for me, it was certainly something whereby my family and friends challenged me, and actually the church kind of pushed me as well. I was in my 20s. I was certainly not a sort of temperamentally holy person. You get a parody of a very pious individual that you think will become a vicar. That was not me during my teenage years and my 20s. I had a lot of fun. And so for me, it was a real, you know, can you do this? And, you know, there are some days where I wake up and I think, was it the right decision? But the whole point is you don't do it in your own strength. You're carried through by the grace of God and actually by the ministry of others. It's teamwork.
Is it hard to be yourself?
Yes. Yes, it can be. And I think sometimes that's important, because sometimes myself wants, on a Sunday morning, to lie in bed, have a bacon sandwich, circa 11:30, watch something rubbish on television, and then go back to bed. You can't do that. So you're sort of... You're dying to self, is the phrase we use, in order to become part of something bigger. Do I always enjoy that? No. Is it good for me? Yes.
And do you find that you have piety superimposed upon you by others? So people are kind of reverent to you and it becomes a little bit of a dynamic?
I think so. I think clergy have to be very careful about that we don't become high on our own supply.
Yeah.
I think there can be a sense of sort of believing our own shtick. And as soon as we are telling other people, you know, moralising around the actions of others without looking deeply at ourselves, there's a problem.
Your years in Liverpool were definitive, weren't they, as a young curate? Formative. Tell me more.
Oh, I mean, it's an astonishing city. I had so much fun there. I was encountering people on a day-to-day basis with incredible stories, being asked to do things I never dreamed, you know, I would do. I remember once this man coming up to me and saying, can you pray for my friend down the phone? I said, of course I'll pray for your friend down the phone. So was down there and there was no words coming. And I said, well, is your friend all right? He said, oh, no, he's fine, he's a dog. So I was essentially having this phone conversation with someone's bull mastiff who was in dog Borstal. I'm not sure that happens anywhere else. I think Liverpool has a kind of flair of its own in that regard.
Yeah, now you're in Kent, which is your home county. Lots of episodes in the book. I mean, it's bittersweet, it's moving, it's hilarious, it's all of the above. Funerals are a bit tricky, aren't they?
They are. Not as tricky as weddings, I would say. Not least because in a wedding, the main two people are alive, whereas in a funeral, the main person isn't. So they can't moan as much. Yeah, they can be tricky because you've got to hold a lot of stuff for people. You've got to give them... The point of being a priest at a wedding is... Sorry, at a funeral, rather, is giving people permission to grieve. Giving them the space to cry, giving them the space to be angry, the space to remember, which very often they don't feel they have.
You priests are great spiritual leaders, revered, looked up to, but you're all human, aren't you? I mean, real life can be a struggle, including Lent.
Absolutely. We're in the midst of Lent now.
How's it going?
It's going well, he says, touching wood.
Have you declared what you've given up?
Yes, I have given up what I've given up for a couple of years. I give up meat and tobacco.
OK.
Two things which I can sort of do. They're a struggle. I think the point about Lent is don't set yourself impossible targets. I've done that a few years. One year I tried to give up a drink, saying I wouldn't drink anything at all, and I lasted, I think, 3 hours.
Right.
It wasn't great. 1 year I tried to fast quite radically through the day. Again, that didn't work. I think set your targets gently so you're actually improving your spiritual.
Well, it shows that you're human, that even priests are no angels. Can God survive the 21st century?
Oh, yes. God survived much worse in the 21st century. And then the point of Christianity, I think this is really important to remember, that in Christianity, death leads to life. And anything that looks like death, anything that looks like the end, we are taught to believe is, in fact, the start of something new. Who knows what direction God will take in the 21st century? I can't look into a crystal ball, but I do have faith in the power of God and of Jesus Christ and of the love that is at the root of that relationship between us and God to survive.
Well, I'll be there on Sunday listening to your sermon. I can't wait. And I've got to say there's love and laughs in the Reverend's brilliant book. It is called Touching Cloth, Confessions and Communions of a Young Priest by the Reverend Fergus Butler Galley. It's receiving rave reviews, and as it should. I look forward to the next tome as well. Rev, thanks for coming in. We'll catch up soon.
Lovely to see you.
Brilliant stuff. Coming up next, in my take at 10, should Tesco reverse their decision to reduce the value of club card points? I'm furious about it, and we're starting a campaign on this show to hashtag restore the points. I've even got my Tesco club card with me. I'm not ruling out chopping it up with a pair of scissors. I've got form on that. Don't forget, we've got your emails as well, and my pundits with tomorrow's papers, live and uninterrupted at 10:30. You can set your watch to it, but it's my take at 10 and Tesco next. I'm taking them down.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I have walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
It's 10 o'clock and this is Mark Dolan Tonight. In my take at 10, should Tesco reverse their decision to reduce the value of club card points? A former Tesco employee and supermarket CEO will debate that, but I'm starting a campaign on Mark Dolan Tonight to hashtag restore those club card points. Also, the newsmaker, as hard-pressed Brits struggle with the cost of living crisis, is the world economy about to collapse? And why does it matter to you and me? We'll speak to a top economics expert. Mark Dolan Tonight is the home of papers, with tomorrow's front pages live at 10:30, and it's a new look. You won't want to miss it. Big guests, big stories, and always big opinions. A lively hour to come. We don't do boring, not on my watch. I just won't have it. Here are the headlines with Tatiana.
Mark, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB newsroom. The French president says King Charles visiting France would have lacked sense when protests are happening across the country. Tens of thousands of people have been demonstrating against the government's plan to raise the pension age from 62 to 64. The King and the Queen Consort were due to arrive on Sunday as part of a week-long trip to Europe. But President Emmanuel Macron has defended postponing their first state visit, suggesting instead a date in the early summer. The Windsor Framework has been formally adopted by the UK and the EU. The Foreign Secretary and European Commission chaired a meeting earlier today to sign off the post-Brexit trade agreement for Northern Ireland. That's after MPs voted in favour of the Stormont break, despite continued opposition from the DUP. The Prime Minister has stressed the importance of upholding democratic values during a meeting with his Israeli counterpart. Benjamin Netanyahu's in London as thousands rally in Israel and here against a law that's been approved by his right-wing coalition. Critics say it's designed to shield him from his corruption trial. Rishi Sunak also called for a de-escalation of tensions in the West Bank. Outside Downing Street, demonstrators describe Netanyahu's controversial reforms as unacceptable. Security guards at Heathrow Airport will go ahead with strikes over the Easter holiday after talks over pay have failed. The airport says it has contingency plans in place to deal with the 10-day walkout by Unite members and keep it running as normal. Heathrow has said it's offered a 10% pay increase to workers. Actress Gwyneth Paltrow has denied being engaged in risky behaviour the day she allegedly skied into a man 7 years ago. Ms Paltrow has given evidence in the witness box on the fourth day of a trial in Utah, where she's being sued for just over £2.5 million. 76-year-old Dr. Terry Sanderson claims he suffered a head injury and broken ribs after being hit from behind by the actress while skiing in Park City in 2016. A skiing instructor claims Sanderson was the one that caused the crash. And the Premier League has referred Everton to an independent commission to question reported losses of over £370 million. Everton's loss during the 2021-22 season allegedly breaches the league's profit and financial sustainability rules, allowing clubs to lose a maximum of £105 million over a 3-year period or face sanctions. In a club statement, Everton said they were disappointed by the Premier League's decision. TV, online, DAB Plus radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now it's back to Mark.
My thanks to Tatiana Sanchez, who returns in an hour's time. Welcome to Mark Dolan Tonight. In the newsmaker, as hard-pressed Brits struggle with the cost of living crisis, is the world economy about to collapse, and why does it matter to you and me? Mark Dolan Tonight is the home of the papers, with tomorrow's front pages from 10:30 with the top pundits in the country and a new look papers. You won't want to miss that. At 10:30, you can set your watch to it. Also, should Liz Truss be allowed to give away honours after just 44 days in power? Lots to get through, a lively hour, big stories, big guests, and always big opinions. Let's start with my take at 10. Tesco, no! The halo has slipped for Britain's favourite supermarket as they reduce the value of club card points just when their millions of customers are struggling hardest with a cost of living crisis. They're not alone. Sainsbury's and Boots have also reduced the value of their loyalty points. And of course, like all businesses, given raging inflation, they're feeling the pinch too. But I think this is a bad misjudgment by their management, because all it will do is send customers running into the arms of Lidl and Aldi and other discount retailers. People specifically choose to go to Tesco and potentially pay a little more in the knowledge they're getting points back for every purchase. And it was a smart business move in the first place to reward customers for their loyalty. So now is surely not the time to punish punters in this way. I'm a big fan of all of our supermarkets, especially Tesco. I love Tesco, a great British business which employs thousands of people of all ages and backgrounds and skill sets. Tesco generates millions for the Exchequer in tax income, and they offer an outstanding range of food, drink, and are a champion of the best British produce. But this is an own goal of epic proportions. And on Mark Dolan Tonight, we implore Tesco, thousands of whose customers watch this show, to reinstate the value of club card points and help us all through these hard times. It's time for Tesco to dig a little deeper and dig themselves out of this crisis. Now, it's clear that Tesco can't compete with Lidl and Aldi in some areas, but customers will tolerate that in order to bank their loyalty points in one of these cheeky little club cards. This is mine. I love it. It's a credit card as well, because just like Britain, I love borrowing. But this is the point. This moment is not Tesco's finest, and they risk customers going elsewhere to taste the difference. What a basket case. There has to be a change at the heart of this company. For Tesco to U-turn on this would be a PR triumph and a deep reassurance to millions of hard-up Brits. Come on, Tesco. We're not asking for the earth, just a small concession. Hashtag restore the points. After all, every little helps. That's right, on Mark Dolan Tonight, we officially start the campaign to hashtag restore the points. If you want to join, then please tweet in on Twitter with hashtag restore the points to @GBNews. Are you a club card holder? What do you think about this? Mark at gbnews.uk. Let me know your thoughts. In fairness to Tesco, they haven't done the change yet, and they will honour those points that you might have accrued for many months to come. But change is coming, and I think they should keep the value they currently enjoy. Mark at gbnews.uk is the email. I'll get to your emails shortly. But with me now, reacting to my take at 10, is Tesco's first ever customer service director and former CEO of Wix and Iceland, Bill Grimsey. Bill, great to have you on the show. You've been the CEO of two of my other favourite shops, Wix and Iceland. Do you think this is an own goal by Tesco?
No, I don't, Mark. So let's kick off with that. I mean, the fact is that you need to look to history just to understand what's going on here. If you go back to the last time we had a cost of living crisis and the kind of inflation we've got on food today, it was 1976, 77. Now, Tesco was a small supermarket chain in those days, and it had a loyalty scheme called Green Shield stamps. Now, this is a history that you're probably too young to remember all this, but I lived through it. Now, what happened then is that Ian McLaurin persuaded the board to say, look, at this time, people do not want loyalty schemes. They want lower prices. So let's ditch Green Shield stamps and plough all of that investment into lower prices and a campaign. And it was called Checkout 77. Their market share went from 7% to 14% overnight. And those are real numbers. It's 30% today, but back then it was that. Now, they couldn't cope. And that led to a big overhaul of their whole infrastructure and supply chain in order to create the Tesco that we've got today. So roll forward the clock today. What do customers really want at a time when it's a cost of living crisis? They want lower prices. They don't want loyalty points. They want lower today prices. So if Tesco has got its head screwed on right and is going to announce, following this reduction in the value of points going forward, an absolute basket of lower prices to all customers at this time, it will work. And that's what customers want. They don't want points. They want lower prices. They can't afford to feed their kids. So it's not necessarily what you think it is, Mark. I hope they're strategically thinking, putting their customer first. And as their first ever customer service director, I remember telling the board, we have to put the customer in the heart of the boardroom and make decisions based on what they need going forward. And what Britain needs going forward is less points and lower prices.
Now, Bill, I defer to your expertise as a top retailer, but there has been a backlash and many people have an emotional attachment to these club cards and they've been using them for years. It's a ritual, it's a habit, and it's all about a relationship with the brand.
It is, and it worked very, very well at a time when price was lower down the decision tree of where you're going to shop. And it got loyalty. It's a loyalty scheme for loyal customers get rewarded.
Not anymore.
Well, it depends on what they do next. If they channel the savings that they're going to make on Club Card into a basket of prices, and let's face it, Tesco ought to be able to outstrip everybody on price. They have got cost price pressures like everybody on energy, staff and all of that stuff, but they're the biggest purchaser of food and household consumable goods in the UK, and they ought to be able to channel any savings that they make on the Club Card into a campaign that says, come on customers, come and shop with us, no one else, because we're the lowest price. And that, over the next 3 years, is what people want, because, Mark, inflation is not going away in the next year.
Phil has emailed Mark. It's not just Tesco who are changing boots, have advised me they're doing the same. Jackie says, bloody Tesco. Nobody respects loyal customers anymore. Time to get your scissors out again, Mark. Make a stand. Let's riot in the streets. I mean, there has been some anger. I take your point about lower prices across the board. But then looking back into history, it was Sainsbury's who were quite snobby about loyalty cards when Tesco had their club card. And in the end, Tesco won the argument.
Well, it was Sainsbury who failed in 1977 to recognise what was needed, which was lower prices. So guess what happened in 1978? A thing called Discount 78 by Sainsbury's to kind of counter Tesco. Now, I think they're reacting to what Tesco are doing, but if all these supermarkets say, look, let's take a holiday on loyalty cards and the money we're spending, channel it into price for the benefit of Great Britain for the next 3 years, get inflation down, get us all back cooking on gas, and then you can then look to bringing back the kind of stuff that you need. But let's face it, you and I probably don't have to look at whether we can put food on the table or heat our houses. But a lot of people in Britain do. So if Tesco are going to use their power and leverage as a result of this strategy and channel it into price, then they will probably come out winners and be respected by the UK public.
Bill, I've only got a couple of seconds left, and you raise an absolutely good point about how so many of my viewers and listeners are struggling. They're choosing sometimes between food and heating their homes. Well, we put it to our massive audience on Twitter. Should Tesco reverse the decision to reduce the value of club card points? And here is the result of that poll. Do you think we're just going to get it up? Because I think it's an interesting one just to show you the strength of opinion. I know it's not scientific, Bill, but it's a sort of snapshot of GB News viewer and listener opinion. Should Tesco reduce club card points? 83% said they should reverse the decision. So they're against what Tesco have done. 17% have said no. Briefly, if you can, Bill, how can that many people be wrong?
Well, I'd like you to put out another Twitter question. Should Tesco channel the savings it's getting from club card into lower prices for the UK public, or should it reverse its decision? And I bet you'll get a different answer.
Bill, a great honour to have a legend of retail. Thank you so much for your time. Former CEO of Wix. I was hoping I'd get a free ladder and a couple of spanners out of that. Also, former CEO of Iceland as well, and the first ever customer service director at Tesco. Let's have a look at this. Bill Grimsey, thank you so much for that, Bill. Fascinating debate. Your reaction, mark at gbnews.uk. Next up, a brand new item in the show, The Newsmaker. As hard-pressed Brits struggle with the cost of living crisis, is the world economy about to collapse? Why does that matter to you and me? Is financial Armageddon coming? Find out next.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories, controversies and issues.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
It's 5 times the opinion, 5 times the debate, and 5 times the fun. The Saturday 5. Saturday nights from 8. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
You could wink at the end. I can't believe I can't Britain's wink. Listening.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching. Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, I tell you something, a very big reaction to my take at 10. On Mark Dolan tonight, I'm starting a campaign to hashtag restore the points. That's Tesco and their club card. They're reducing the value of their points. We want them to U-turn on that decision, and there's a lot of support online. Mark says, Peter, you're right about Tesco. When they stopped doing Avios, that reduced my loyalty and credit card expenditure by 75%. Well, the other 25% is about to go. Their checkouts are faster than Morrison's, but the meat and fish in the Kraut supermarkets is good value. I think, Peter, they're referring to Lidl and Aldi. You guys don't pull your punches. How about this from Bernard? Good evening, Bernard. How are you? Thanks for emailing the show, mark@gbnews.uk. It just goes to show, and like most of our MPs, Bill Grimsey is out of touch. Most people save up the club card points and use them over Christmas or as a present. Therefore, this is a disappointing policy. It should be reversed. I'll get to more of your emails shortly. And we'll get to more of your opinions, mark@gbnews.uk. But it's time now for this, another important topic. And it's a brand new item on the show called The Newsmaker, in which we tackle a big story of the day in the company of a fearless commentator. So should we be worried about collapsing banks? Why does it matter to you and me? Sharp declines in banking shares in Europe have renewed concerns that the panic triggered by the collapse of 2 US banks and the rushed takeover of Swiss giant Credit Suisse may be the tip of the iceberg. Shares in Germany's Deutsche Bank fell by 14% at one point today, with other lenders also suffering big losses. Stock markets in Germany and France down big time. So should we be worried? Is the world economy about to collapse? Let's speak to one of America's most popular online talk show hosts, best-selling author and economics expert, Yaron Brook. Hi, Yaron.
Hey, Mark, how's it going?
I'm very well. Is the world economy about to fall over?
I don't think it's about to fall over, but we should all be worried. I think we are entering into a period of economic slowdown. We're entering into a period of, I think, ultimately a lot of layoffs, companies shutting down. It's a worrisome time to be employed or to own a business or to be involved in economic activities. I think of Europe, or UK, and the United States.
In countries like Britain and America, what do you think is going to happen to inflation?
Well, it seems like inflation is a lot more stubborn than people expected it to be. It has not responded so far to the rising interest rates. I ultimately think the Federal Reserve at the Bank of England will resolve the issue of inflation. It's going to take some pain, though. This is not going to be a free lunch. There are no free lunches. We have to pay for the inflation we caused. We have to pay for the zero interest rate environment that has existed since the great financial crisis. What is it now? 14 years ago. We have to pay for all the spending during COVID, the lockdowns, the fact that people didn't work and they got money anyway. All of that, there are no free lunches in the world. And ultimately, what we're seeing today with inflation, the rising interest rates, and I think the bankruptcies to come as a consequence of the rising interest rates, that's the payment. That is due, and I don't think there's any way to avert it.
Could there be a banking crash, the likes of which we saw in 2008 and 2009?
I think it's unlikely. I think the banks are far better capitalized today than they were back then. I think that they have more liquidity. They are doing better. What we've seen is a banking collapse here in the United States, but it's not of the magnitude of 08, 09. And I think as the data comes out in the next few weeks, we will see that the banking crisis here, it was probably an overselling and things are going to get better. But I think this is just a symptom of something much bigger. The banking crisis in the U.S. and to some extent Credit Suisse, and I fear Deutsche Bank, a lot of this is a response to rising interest rates. As interest rates rise, the value of assets goes down. As interest rates rise, the value of the bank loans go down. The value of the treasury, of the securities they own, goes down. But it's also true that as interest rates rise, it's harder for businesses to refinance their debt. It's harder for people who own who want to buy a home to get a mortgage at a reasonable price. Every asset loses value, and the cost for people to buy those assets and to refinance those assets rises. And that's where you get the problem. You get the problem with banks who are underwater because a lot of their assets, the value of the assets has declined. And you're going to get a problem with companies who are used to refinancing their debt at zero interest rates, suddenly have to pay 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% interest rates. They can't afford that. They're going to have to lay people off. They're going to have to cut jobs, and some of them will actually go bankrupt.
The West has a debt problem, doesn't it? I mean, the UK national debt is £2.5 trillion. The US debt is just an unimaginably larger amount than that. We've got household debt, governments are in debt. Where's this going? Where does this lead? And why should my viewers and listeners care, Yaron?
Well, because the only way to reduce the debt, the only way, put it this way, the only way that governments know how to reduce the debt is by either raising your taxes. All of you should care about that, because it's not just going to be taxes on the so-called rich, because there are not enough of them and they don't have enough money. They're going to have to tax everybody to reduce the debt, or it means inflating the currency. I mean, one of the things that happens when inflation goes up is the value of government debt goes down. One of the reasons governments inflate is to reduce the value of their debt. And who pays for that inflation? Inflation is a hidden tax. It's a hidden tax on consumers. It's a hidden tax. Everything you're paying now, you're paying more for everything that you buy. That is a tax on your income, on your consumption, on your saving. And ultimately, that is done in order to reduce that government debt. So look, the only people who can reduce the government debt are us, are taxpayers, whether it's through inflation or through increased taxes. So everybody should care about this. Now, the rational way to reduce government debt is to cut spending. But that's the one thing nobody wants to talk about. That's the one thing politicians will never do. It reduces their power. It reduces the impact on all of our lives. And that's the one thing they don't touch. But what we need today in the West is to shrink government, to get government out of our lives, to get government to get the regulatory state to shrink dramatically. And I know this is probably not popular in Britain, but to shrink the welfare state. We need to shrink the welfare state, and we need to encourage job creation, encourage people to get jobs. And as productivity will go up, wages go up, and people don't need that welfare.
Well, I completely agree with you, Yaron. That was the topic of my big opinion last Sunday. Britain lives beyond its means. Find out why Yaron is such a big star in the United States. Go to YouTube for the Yaron Brooks Show. He's got thousands of subscribers. He's a best-selling author as well. Yaron will catch up soon. My thanks to Yaron Brooks, broadcaster and economics whiz. We've got the papers next. New look in a brand new part of the studio with my top pundits. Don't go anywhere.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel. New Look Papers on Mark Dolan Tonight at 10:30 every Friday and Saturday. Let's do it. There you go. We'll put 10p in the meter and get that fired next time. We do have tomorrow's papers. They are hot off the press with reaction from 3 top pundits. And where should we start? OK, we've got the Telegraph first. Hot off the press, they lead with UK reset with EU in disarray as King's visit cancelled. Trip had been part of government strategy to renew historic ties with Europe following Brexit. John Lewis has let go of its soul, says Professor Jonathan... Sorry, it's not Jonathan Portas, it's Mary Portas, the retail consultant and former Downing Street advisor, in a scathing open letter to Dame Sharon, who, of course, runs John Lewis. She's the chairman, the incoming chief executive as well. She said that she was speaking on behalf of the nation as it emerged that John Lewis could water down its staff ownership model. BBC to privatise choir following climb down. And death and destruction if I'm charged, says Donald Trump. Also, migrants could be moved from hotels to ferries is another story in the Daily Telegraph. The Times next. Chaos reigns in France. The King's first state visit was abruptly called off today after President Macron was warned it would becoming the target of an escalating nationwide revolt in France against his pension reforms. Shocking scenes in Paris. Rue Saint-Marc in Paris. Smouldering heaps of rubbish littered the centre of the capital after anger at President Macron's pension reforms. Daily Express. Royal tour axed after fears for safety of King. Daily Mail. Macron surrenders to the mob. French President Emmanuel Macron stood accused of bowing to violence tonight after he cancelled the King's visit to France. The French president has been left humiliated as he fails to get a grip on mob-driven riots that have lasted 10 days. Macron admitted he was forced to call King Charles to delay the state visit, which would have involved a banquet at the Palace of Versailles on Monday evening. The Guardian, brutal Ofsted regime driving us to quit, warn school heads. School leaders in England say that they're being driven out of the profession by Ofsted's punishing inspection regime, blaming a culture of fear and high stress for damaging their health and careers. King Charles' trip to France postponed is also a story in The Guardian. And phones could be removed in theatres. Audiences may have to hand in phones to prevent illicit images of actors being taken during performances. The Daily Mirror, NHS dental crisis. So desperate, I went to Ukraine to get my teeth fixed. A man with severe toothache went to war-torn Ukraine just to sort out his gnashers. And the Daily Star, The Great Stink Part 2. Half-baked baguettes blamed for causing global guffing crisis. Pardon us, but the world is in the midst of a global farting pongdemic that can be blamed squarely on part-baked baguettes. Sacre bleu. It's official. Excess farting is not our fault. And those are your front pages. Reacting to them, we have my top pundits tonight. Journalist and broadcaster Stephanie Tecci, political commentator and former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards, and the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Stephanie, let's start with the King's visit to France, cancelled, and a lost diplomatic opportunity.
Definitely so. But, you know, sometimes when these situations happen, you realise how much power the people have. Well, how much power the French people have. And they're not going to take it lying down with these such of changes. Obviously, the British people were much more courteous, much more have that stiff upper lip, so we're not going to react as much. But I think it would have been a bit of a deadly venture for King Charles to go to France at such a time like this.
Yes, I mean, we're always hearing what a disaster Britain is, an undemocratic hellhole. Look at the mess in France at the moment, Peter.
France is a mess, and I'm amazed at having taken part in strikes myself, including over pay and pensions, that they're striking over working to the ripe old age of 64.
Yes.
But, you know...
we can only dream of that.
But, you know, France is a foreign country.
Is it 67 in the UK?
I believe so, but there's a trajectory for it going upwards. And, of course, you know, all being well, we'll live till we're 80 or 90. The Express... have taken quite a fervent stance, if you can flash that up, because they say the tour was axed on safety grounds because of the King. I think this is really about public relations. The whole coverage has this very 1789 revolutionary Marie Antoinette flavour about it. It's quite funny to read. Neither a new king nor any politician wants to be tied to a let-them-eat-cake type mentality. I do think there was a threat to Charles. I think everyone realised having the president and the King having a very expensive dinner in a very expensive place while there's a riot outside is not a good look.
Probably not a great look. I think you're right. It would have been a PR disaster. Henry, is unrest in Western Europe a concern for all of us?
I think it's a sign in France specifically. France is a very special case. I think we have to say this. Western Europe, you know, if you think about Germany and Spain, this is a very French phenomenon. But it's a sign of how deeply rooted some of the problems in France are, because as you're right, they are fundamentally striking over what would to us look like very, very milquetoast economic policies. And in many other areas of life, the French trades unions and so on have managed to deliver an excellent deal over many decades. But we're now at the point where France can't really afford it and are struggling to change it. And if you're talking about Britain being undemocratic, it's the French system that allows the president to rule by decree, which is how Emmanuel Macron got these reforms through in the first place.
He tried to put it through Parliament. I think Parliament said no, or he didn't have the numbers.
Precisely, and then he used the presidential power, which he does have, and he does have an electoral mandate to put it through. I think one of the things that's important to bear in mind within the UK, when you think about the fact we don't riot, the government also, it does a lot of unpopular stuff, but it doesn't really take on public opinion in this way in quite the same way as often.
No, indeed. So migrants could be moved from hotels to ferries. This according to the Daily Telegraph. Rishi Sunak is expected to declare as early as next week the beginning of the end of asylum hotels, which are being used to house more than 50,000 migrants at a cost of nearly £7 million a day. Migrants will initially be moved into decent but rudimentary accommodation in former military bases. But there are plans to consider disused ferries as well. Will that wash, do you think? Will that work, Henry Hill?
As an interim measure, maybe, it will be less politically toxic than hotels, which is, I think, what the government is thinking about. But one of the big problems with our asylum system is that we have all of these people who are in here, who are in the UK for years while we process them, and we have failed to build a dedicated asylum estate to keep them in decent conditions. And the reason for that is because no MP wants that in their constituency. Every local council where you try and build it will kick off. But unless we bite the bullet and we build places for these people to live while we're processing them, the Home Office is going to continue having to flail around, finding obsolete ships, finding hotel bedroom places.
You've got your finger on the pulse of Conservative public opinion. Do you think that Rishi Sunak's messaging on stopping the boats is starting to cut through now?
It is, to an extent, but the big danger for the Conservatives on issues like this that they've done for years, especially on Home Office stories, is they talk really loudly about it and then they don't get anything done. And that's actually really counterproductive, because what they're doing is they're highlighting the issue, they're reminding the voters that this is a problem, but then if they don't actually marry that to a successful solution, and they have consistently failed to do that for several years, that will hurt them. So the key thing now is that he actually carries through on his promises. If he can, that will be really good, but if he doesn't, all of this will come back to bite.
And Peter Edwards, you've got to say, the Tories are owning the stop the boats narrative at the moment, aren't they? Here, the latest story in The Telegraph, that migrants could be moved from hotels to ferries, a policy that will probably play well in those red wall seats that Labour needs to take back.
I'm not sure it will at all, because I think it's complete madness. And it's like something out of Monty Python or Alan Partridge. The idea that the answer to government and Home Office failures in processing is to stick people on a boat and send them round the UK and round and round and round again. It's either ludicrous and absurd, or it's inhumane and tragic, but I don't think it's the answer.
Disused other facilities, disused military facilities, old schools?
As Henry alluded to, there's a real problem about not having a permanent base or processing centre for people in very difficult but also quite varied circumstances. And, of course, constituency politics does come into play. I think I'd make a broader point, which is what worries me. I thought we got beyond the point of government by tough announcement, then ridicule, then U-turn. We seem to have slipped back into that again.
On the subject of U-turn, unless it's off the front page, they're not suggesting sailing the ferries around, right? I think the ferries are going to be anchored somewhere. They're not going to be
is that
sailing
somehow better
around.
or worse?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, a ferry is a series of purpose-built accommodation, and you can simply anchor it somewhere and put people in it. That's not inherently ridiculous. Sailing it around the UK would be absurd, but using those facilities, which are perfectly serviceable for people using, ferries and ships, using that as somewhere to put people to live is not absurd.
Don't you feel it's a bit inhumane, though?
Not why. These are places with bedrooms and indoor plumbing and galleys and fooding and all the food and all the other stuff. The mere fact that it's on water is not inherently inhumane. These are not prison camps.
And this is to accommodate people that have entered the country illegally.
I know, but it's just like, fair enough, it's cheaper, but I still don't feel like we're tackling the problem of migrants. We're just taking them from one boat onto a ship and just dumping them there.
Is it messaging? Is it like the Rwanda plan, Stephanie, that it's about messaging to actually the people traffickers and their business model, that they cannot lie on Facebook and TikTok about this wonderful new life you've had, or you'll have, because actually what will happen is you'll go onto a ferry or you'll be shipped out to Rwanda.
I think they'll be aware of that, but I think as well they know where there's a will, there's a way, and they're just going to keep on changing their business model. Because I think, at the moment, it's almost like this migrant problem is bigger than any politician and any government that's going to come and inherit this poison chalice. I think there's always, think about at the moment, there's 120 million migrants on the move at the moment.
Yeah.
How do we tackle them all?
Indeed. I mean, Peter, I'm just looking at Professor Matthew Goodwin, who's a top academic at the University of Kent. He's been tweeting the latest polling in regards to stop the boats and the public's view of it. If you don't think stopping the boats is important, you are the 16%. The vast majority of the public think it's very important and it's an issue that needs sorting and could decide the next election.
I think it is important, and I think it will be a feature in the debate around the next general election. But at the risk of being ultra-specific, Rishi Sunak's pledge was not to solve the small boats crisis. It was purely to pass a law that might solve the small boats crisis. And I really think sticking people on a disused ferry is madness. And to end, I think, two words that we often hear, followed by Cyrilla Braverman announcement, are judicial review.
OK, what's your reaction to this developing story in tomorrow's Telegraph, that migrants could be moved from hotels to ferries? Your reaction, please, Mark, at gbnews.uk. I'll get to your views just after the break. We've also got The Independent, an amazing headline in the Indie. That's next. Also, why drinking is to be banned from some parts of the UK. What's going on? See you in 2.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now? Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
More emails coming in response to this developing story from today's Daily Telegraph. Migrants could be moved from hotels to ferries. Richard says, Mark, workers live on oil rigs for months. That's not inhumane. I think this is a very good and sensible idea. Mark says, Camille, if putting illegal immigrants on a ferry or disused army barracks or school acts as a deterrent, then yes, it would be a good move. Why is there anything wrong with housing illegal migrants in ferries or cruise ships, says G. Matheson. Why is there an outcry about sturgeon housing Ukrainian families on cruise liners in Edinburgh? Or does that not count? There you go. Look, Pam finally on this one. Pam says, perhaps the migrants on ferries or cruise ships could work whilst they're being processed. Oh, there you go. And now we've got more front pages. This is The Independent. And they lead with fire and fury as violent French pensions revolt cancels King's state visit. Charles III, do you know the guillotine, was daubed in sinister graffiti outside Parliament in Paris. There you go. France in meltdown. Can I just say, and put it on record, on the radio and on TV, that if this was happening in Britain, the world's press will be talking about what a disaster Britain has become. But as it's France, it's a different story. Funny that, isn't it? Now, reacting to tomorrow's front pages, we have journalist and broadcaster Stephanie Tecci. Political commentator and former editor of Labour List, Peter Edwards, and the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. Let's go to tomorrow's Sun newspaper now. And drinking at bus stops or war memorials is to be banned, and yobs are to be forced to scrub up high streets. More on-the-spot fines will be issued and drug tests carried out in a drive to see offences rapidly and publicly punished. The Blitz, to be launched on Monday, will see graffiti menaces marched back to the scene of their crime in high-vis jackets and made to clear up the mess within 24 hours of getting caught. Stephanie Tetchy, your reaction?
I'm actually up for this, actually, because sometimes, you know, you need to make sure people are paying for their crimes. And I think by actually letting people know that, actually, no, we've actually toughened our laws and this is what you can expect if you commit this crime, it might actually deter young people from doing such crimes.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, what do we think, though, about setting the precedent of banning alcohol consumption in certain places? I worry about that, Peter, that it could be the slippery slope.
Well, there is a precedent already, which is, of course, for people living in the capital, you're not allowed to drink or carry an open can anywhere on the Transport for London network. I think that was introduced by Boris Johnson, but it's not really caught on in other parts of the country, as far as I know. On this story, I think it is, it's incredibly disrespectful to get drunk at a war memorial. But again, there's a bit of an announcement, itis about it. You know, yobs, quote unquote, can already be made to clean up their high street under community service. That's been around for my entire lifetime.
OK, what do we think about this? The war on antisocial behaviour, Henry?
Well, it is really important to tackle what's sometimes called low-level crime, because that's often the thing that really impacts people day-to-day in their communities, and this kind of thing can affect lots of people. So that's fine. I am worried about the ban because it hasn't caught on. I remember, actually, the big party that people had on the Circle Line the day before Boris Johnson's booze ban came in, when they went round and round getting drunk. But in America, for example, there is a general trend that I think in at least big cities you can't be seen intoxicated or with an open container on the street. And it's just a creeping pervasion of the state, and it represents, instead of cracking down on the people who are actually committing the offences, it's cracking down on everybody. I think most people can walk home drunk, or you have a drink on the street or walking between houses or the pub, and they're fine. And I don't want to see all of those people potentially criminalised for the sake of cracking down on people who abuse that freedom to commit disorder.
Could you survive without Wetherspoons? The famous and iconic pub chain has warned that it may have to hike its prices as its sales are not as good as it had hoped. Many of its pub favourites will have a hike in price as well, with the Ultimate Burger, personal favourite of mine, their little deal with a drink as well, is going from under a tenner to almost £11, and the Chicken Tikka Masala will be going the same way. So whatever happened to a cheap night out? Could you survive without Wetherspoons, Peter?
Well, I spent a lot of my sixth form in Wetherspoons in Essex. I've not been in as much in recent years, but the price increase, although it's a lot in percentage-wise, it's not too much in pounds. I looked up quickly. The average price for a pint in London is £5.99.
Crazy.
£6, folks. Wetherspoons is still relatively value, a bit like McDonald's. It's not to everyone's taste, but I hope it carries on going.
But when Wetherspoons isn't cheap, you know you're in trouble, Stephanie.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's tough times. Businesses do have to put up their prices. And you know what? Even though I would not step foot in a Wetherspoons, it does serve its purpose.
Not?
No, because it reminds me
I would love to take you out. Can I invite you to, with Mrs. Dolan's permission, can I invite you to go out? Maybe we'll take Henry and Peter as well.
We'll all go.
If they've got a nice Prosecco, then it can
they've got
happen.
everything at Wetherspoons.
Well, it just reminds me of when I was 18 to 25, and it does serve its purpose in that sense. And it is a British establishment, which I wouldn't want to see go off the high street. But it is tough times for businesses, and everyone does need to put up their prices.
Are you more all bar one?
No, I'm more the Ivy, Mark.
Of course you are. Never even heard of it. Henry, what about the spoons? Iconic British brand. We can't be doing without it. No town is complete without a Wetherspoons, is it?
No, and I think one of the things that Wetherspoons actually does really well is, as a bit of an architecture geek, is that they buy up old buildings on high streets like theatres and banks that might otherwise be empty or knocked down, and they restore them, and that's a really important...
Old cinemas, banks, you name it.
Precisely. So that's actually a really important social function that Wetherspoons performs. I think for me, the seal was broken on sacrosanct price increases when the Tesco meal deal was no longer £3. I think once that bastion had fallen, it was fair game. But it does represent the pressure on businesses, and also the way that this will bite people people who can least afford it, because there are people up the income chain who will be much less impacted by small price rises in cash terms. But for Wetherspoons, that will really bite some people.
Stephanie, the clock's against us. I'm going to give this one to you exclusively. Tragic story of the head teacher who took her own life after receiving a terrible downgrade in the Ofsted from outstanding to, I can't remember what the actual definition was, but it was inadequate, I think. Very, very tough, but the school hadn't been tested in many years. My heart goes out to her family.
It does.
But schools have been in sympathy and saying we won't let Ofsted in.
Yeah.
And I think this is a worrying development. What do you think?
I feel like Ofsted needs to be modernised, because I remember when I was in school and we were told Ofsted were coming to inspect the schools. Every school gets on their best behaviour, but it's not a real snapshot of what actually goes on in the education system. I feel like you need to be monitoring schools more than a day, or just springing up here and there.
But don't families want to know if the school down the road is crap?
Well, I think it needs to be a better communication now between the school establishments and the parents. I just feel like Ofsted has lost its way a bit.
Fair enough. OK, well, look, grey walls, grey floors, grey corner sofa, grey crushed velvet headboard, grey fences surrounding gardens, purged of life in favour of grey paving slabs and pebbles, grey rattan outdoor furniture and a fire pit, put my teeth back in. So flammable, so Instagrammable. Look, the world has gone grey. We've become obsessed with grey colouring inside our interiors. Is it time we injected some colour back into our lives? Should we bring back wallpaper to brighten up Britain's living rooms? What do you think, Peter? What colour is your living room?
My living room is pretty bland, but my tea towels are varied. Get yourselves down to Emma Bridgewater. Other tea towel manufacturers are available, but, Emma Bridgewater tea towels, a bit of colour, there's a sense of Jackson Pollock about it. Brighten up your houses.
You're into architecture. This grey interior obsession's got to go, hasn't it?
I think it's certainly depressing, although my tastes run slightly more to the minimal, but they don't run to the Victorian. But I think it's also a fact that we're constantly told to design our homes with an eye on sale now. Blank white walls, minimalist furniture, that's what every estate agent will tell you to do. So if you invest in all of this beautiful colour that the Victorians used to have...
Yeah.
It's going to knock some value off your house price.
Well, we've had plenty of colour from my panel tonight. My thanks to Stephanie, Henry and Peter. Headliners is next, and we're back tomorrow at 9. See you then.
Good evening and welcome to your latest weather update from the Met Office with me, Annie Shuttleworth. Now through Saturday, it will stay showery with some sunshine around, but then into Sunday, we see a bit of a shift as our winds turn to more of a northerly. But for now, through the rest of Friday, we've still got this area of low pressure that's going to be bringing a rather unsettled evening and a westerly breeze, so still quite blustery all the way through Friday night. So some quite heavy showers will affect parts of Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northern England, and further south just about anywhere are likely to see some showers. Across parts of Scotland we could see some of the showers falling as snow over the high ground. But for all of us it'll be a breezy night tonight, and because of that temperatures will hold up. So a relatively mild start to the weekend, but quite cloudy across the country, and a few showers still lasting well into the morning. It'll stay breezy at the start, but as we head into the afternoon, the winds will start to lighten and the sunshine across parts of Wales and central areas of England will start to feel quite warm. So here we'll see highs of around 14 or 15 degrees. However, to the north of that, it'll start to feel a little bit chillier. Then through the end of Saturday evening, we'll see many areas seeing quite a lot of dry weather continuing. However, notice across the south, this band of quite persistent rain will move up northwards, bringing some persistent rain overnight into Sunday morning across many southern areas of Wales and England. To the north of that cold air is starting to show its face, and because of that, we could see a bit of a frost across parts of Scotland, perhaps northern England, to start on Sunday. And that cold feel will become